Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to all of you on the final day of the 5th Dvara Research Conference on the theme of household finance. My name is Niyati Agrawal. I'm a research associate with the household finance practice at Dvara, and I will be your host for today. Before beginning, Before beginning today's session, I would like to give a shout out to all our collaborators without whom this conference wouldn't have been possible. Omidyar Network, TransUnion Sybil, Robert Bosch Center for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at IIT Madras, Dwara KGFS, and Dwara Trust. To recap, over the past 5 days, we uncovered some important insights about the financial lives of low-income households and reflected on how some of the key findings can be used in designing better policies and products for the traditionally excluded segments. Some of the key questions that have emerged under these themes are: what is the role of unconditional cash transfers in the lives of migrant workers, and what are the other coping mechanisms adopted by them in the face of the pandemic? How do the intra-household dynamics vary with the type of migration and the impact on financial preferences? How do the financial portfolios of the low-income households look like, and what are the gaps that remain? And finally, we also explored some of the key challenges faced by low-income households in accumulating savings and the reasons behind their choices of financial products, along with the role of intra-household dynamics in forming these decisions. From the perspective of the FSPs, we uncovered that there is a need for continued innovation in both products and processes to bring affordable and flexible financial services to the low-income segment. Now that I have given you a recap, I would like to uncover today's theme of applied data science in household finance research. Before we start the session, a couple of housekeeping pointers for the audience. Please drop your questions in the chat box towards the right-hand side of your web page, which the speakers will take up during the Q&A session at the end of all the presentations. Also, it would be great if you can add your names when you drop your questions. If you wish not to, you can choose to drop them as anonymous as well. So, without further ado, I'd like to begin today's session by inviting Ms. Navita Parthsarthi, Research Associate at IIIT Bangalore, and Mr. Sachit Rao, Assistant Professor at IIIT Bangalore, to talk about their paper titled Event History Analysis of Household Finance Data. You have 50 minutes for your presentation, and we'll take all the questions in the Q&A session after all the presentations get over. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Niyati. Glad to be here. My name is Sachit. I work at IIIT Bangalore, so I'll be making the presentation for two of us. I'll just share my screen here. Okay, so I'm guessing all of you can see my screen. Yeah, so the title of my talk, as you can see here, is characterizing the over-indebted and event history analysis of financial diaries. So this is again in the data science focused stream, as Niyati has already mentioned. Just turn off my video in the interest of bandwidth. Okay, as Niyati just introduced, there have been many points of interest of low-income households which have been investigated and debated over the last few days. And today we'll be primarily looking at one of those aspects, which is over-indebtedness in low-income households. And this was a topic that we were introduced to in our discussions with colleagues from Dvara ever since we started this project. So there was sufficient interest for us to investigate how can we characterize households that become over-indebtedness, their possible causes of over-indebtedness, and what can be actually done. So in the course of the study, we found that even to define over-indebtedness and how do we measure them, there seems to be no consensus on definitions. So there are many definitions, and then we'll be looking at some of them. And then I'll briefly describe the method that we have adopted in order to define over-indebtedness and to characterize some households. So we'll be using the financial diaries data provided by Dvara. So this is a longitudinal data set. We'll be taking you in some detail on the data set itself and the model that we have, the methodology that we have adopted in order to characterize over-indebtedness. So we'll be using this technique known as event history or survival analysis, which is actually very popular in the medical science, being used for several decades now. There has been some interest over the last few years in using this particular approach in the financial domain. and we'll see whether it's indeed applicable here or not. And then, of course, the results of applying these models, and what is it that they actually tell us about how to characterize households that are over indebted. Just one thing okay, now let me start, and then we can uh, and then I can take you through some of the finer details of the work that we have done. So there's clearly a role of the role that microfinancial institutions play in low-income households has been well identified. Given that we are in day 5 of the conference, I suppose there is no need for me to get into too much detail about that. But in the context of this work, so there's been some interest in how can MFIs play a role from the perspective of consumer protection. We have all heard of overheated MFI markets that have such instances which have happened historically, and of course now from some of the papers that we have read, there are sufficient regulations that are in place in order to ensure that people don't get oversold these small microfinance loans. So this paper actually does not offer any policy solutions because it's a data science focused work. Rather, we present some models, we present some mathematical analysis, and then show how many of the definitions of over-indebtedness actually diverge, and whether diverge or whether there are any points of convergence. And then because we are not policy experts in this domain, we present the results, and then we can provide some hints or provide some suggestions on how policy experts can actually use these definitions in maybe customizing formal financial products to low-income households in order that the phenomenon of over-indebtedness actually does not occur. So one of the problems that we faced in the course of this work is, how do you even measure over indebtedness? What are the definitions? How can we even measure it? And then the next step is, once we have defined it, once we know how to measure this particular parameter, what are the possible influences that would lead a household to become over indebted? So these are some of the things that we have seen. And their financial diaries data is a very rich data set that does cover some of these that does provide a lot of information about some of these attributes, things like shocks that the household would face, the number of loans that it has taken, the types of loans that it has taken, and so and also the socio-demographic information of the households that are available. So using all this data, can we actually characterize such households? So from a policy decision point of view, so we present a model, and then so now if a household with a particular history were to come and apply for a loan, or were to say that, look, I'm in need of something, then perhaps this the use of these models can help in customizing formal financial products in order to ensure that the household doesn't become over indebted. So one of the things that we wanted to focus on, because we look at longitudinal data, is what does over indebtedness, is it a permanent state of the household, or is it something that is transient? Do households continue to remain over indebted, or do they get out of this state and then come into some sort of solvency? Okay, so this is like a brief introduction to why we even chose over indebtedness as something to be measured in low income households. So there are diverse definitions of over indebtedness, and as you can see from the two references that are provided here, so we've taken what we thought were slightly different definitions of this particular phenomenon, and then we wanted to construct some models on this, and then actually see where they depart or where they converge. So the first one is on using the notion of sacrifice. So we say that a household becomes over indebted if it makes sacrifices in order to meet its loan repayments. Okay? So in a particular month, if it suppose it has to spend a quantum of its income just to meet its loan obligations, and they would actually have to sacrifice on their basic living expenses in that particular month, is when we term this as a household becoming over indebted. But again, the devil is always in the details. So how do we now define sacrifices? So again, I'll give you some indicators on how we defined it, and possibly other suggestions that can be taken in order to define sacrifice, in order to measure it. Then, of course, we have the conventional definitions of from a more quantitative perspective with respect to debt to income ratio. So, how much does a household spend in repaying the loan in contrast to with respect to its monthly income? So, again, monthly income here does not actually include the income from the loan that it has taken, but it could be from various sources. And we have seen that households do have several sources of income apart from what they claim is their primary source of income. So there's sufficient. In many cases, we find that there is irregular income. In some cases, we find that there is no income at all in a particular month. So these are the two definitions that we have used in order to measure over-indebtedness. I mean, in order that we can actually come up with metrics for over-indebtedness. Uh, so now what is the so given that we are using this concept of sacrifice, how do we actually define over-indebtedness? So we say that if the regular expenses in a particular month for the basic category, so again I'll tell you what these basic categories are. If the amount of the amount of expense that a household makes in these basic categories is less than what is suggested in per capita for the particular region in which the household is located, then we say that this household has actually made a sacrifice in that particular month uh, for various reasons. And then, of course, the debt to income ratio is a fairly straightforward number to calculate. Uh, so a household would have maybe would have paid some amount from its income towards repaying its loan, and what is the amount that has been paid. So here we have taken a number of 30%. Again, what I would like to stress here is that the approach that we have followed, which is event history analysis, allows for allows for these definitions to be actually tweaked in its application in order to characterize households that become over indebted. So if 30% is maybe too liberal, so if 10% or 20% is something that is recommended, then the definitions can be easily changed, yeah, but the basic methodology continues to remain the same. So, in order to apply these two definitions and to actually say whether a household becomes over-indebted or not, we're going to be using the financial diaries, which again, as I said, is longitudinal data. So, attributes of the household are measured at regular intervals of time. And I'll give you a brief introduction to what the diaries data set is. So this was collected with using monthly interviews from about 400 households in Krishnagiri district in Tamil Nadu. So for over a year, so we essentially have 12 months of data for every household. So the paper that I have referred to here has analyzed the data set in greater detail with respect to the sort of attributes that it has, and at the surface level, what are the sort of insights that we can get by simply looking at the data that is collected. So there are over 150 attributes. I must say that it's a very, very rich data set, a very detailed data set, but they're self-reported answers. And but I also have to say that financial diaries has been used by many researchers in the literature in order to answer several research problems. So even though the answers may be self-reported, there are still many insights that can be obtained, because ultimately it is the household that is going to say whether they've either spent too much or spent too little. So there is sufficient evidence to show why financial diaries are a valid data set to work with. So apart from all the financial information about the particular households, there's also social demographic information such as the household size, the number of primary income earners, secondary income earners, dependents over the age of 60, dependents under the age of 18. How much did they spend on school fees? Did they spend on medical expenses? Did they spend on footwear in a particular month, for example? So it's a very rich data set to work with. And so this is what we'll be using in order to be able to characterize households that become over indebted. So just a brief overview about the methodology of event history analysis. I mean, it's also well known as survival analysis, because these methods were originally applied to determine whether a person or people would actually die of some ailment or some malady, or to determine whether a particular treatment has actually changed the influence of, has maybe increased the probability of survival. So although the name does indicate that ultimately it is going to lead to death, in the financial domain, the event history analysis has been applied by many researchers. So, for example, this method has been adopted to predict the bankruptcy of firms, business firms, payment defaults by startup companies, and the solvency of insurers. Again, I have to highlight here that the events, as is required in the methodology of event history analysis, need not be absorbing. That is, they need not actually lead to death. So we can look at events that can change in time. They can recur over a span of over the span in which the study was conducted, or they may not occur at all. So we do have all possibilities of these events. And one of the important reasons why EHA, or survival analysis, is quite appealing is primarily because of the nature of the data that is available to us, by which analysis can be performed. So the data here are become what are known as the covariates, and they're essentially censored. So in this case, covariates are basically the household information. So all we know about this household was when the study began, and when the study ended. So we really don't know what happened before the study started and what happened after the study ended. We do know, of course, whether some events occurred during the duration of the study. So this is known as the censored data, and event history analysis allows for censored data to be used in order to perform the analysis. So again, the paper that I've cited here has many references, many applications, and descriptions of EHA in various topics in the financial domain. Of course, there are also applications in wildlife management, and needless to say, in the area of medicine as well. Okay, so here are some mathematical aspects about the nature of about the statistical model that we'll essentially be working with as a part of the event history analysis. So we are essentially trying to. So what we propose to do is build what is known as the Cox proportional hazards model. So with the event history analysis, what we are essentially calculating is what is known as the time to event, the probability of a time to event. So here the time could be in discrete intervals, like what we have with the financial diary. So we have data that is collected every month, and what what EHA would give us is what is known as the survival function, which you can see from the equation here. So the survival function basically gives us the probability of the time to event. So when an event would occur, so it gives us a probability of when this event would occur, given the covariates. So x1 and x2 are the covariates, and beta1 and beta2 are the regression coefficients. So again, here this particular method is semi-parametric, so it does not actually need a baseline model. And what the model construction is carried out by first determining the regression coefficients beta1, beta2, and then actually testing them out on unseen data. This is a standard procedure in many data science related fields. But what does this ultimately tell us with respect to characterizing households? So the signs of the coefficients beta1, beta2 will essentially tell us what sort of households, or households with these characteristics, whether they are at higher risk than other households. So essentially this model gives us relative hazards, essentially because we are not computing a baseline, and assuming a model for a baseline again has its own issues. Uh, so so I mean, as you can see from the text, so if a particular household with some covariates has a higher hazard, then it essentially means that there's lower probability of survival. So the probability that this event will occur actually essentially increases, and that's basically what we are trying to evaluate when we want to find out whether a household is on the verge of becoming over-indebted, whether it actually gets out of it, or what are the odds that it would maybe sometime in the future does become over-indebted. So that's basically what we want to present, or what we want to analyze using this particular approach with the financial diaries data. So how do we go about doing this? So from the diaries data and all the definitions that we have considered for over-indebtedness, so we pose the using the definitions, we pose the the occurrence of over-indebtedness in a household as an event. And all the characteristics of the household become the covariates, which I just told you were the variables x1, x2 in the previous equation. And what the survival function tells us is the probability of occurrence. Uh, although it may feel that we are okay. First of all, why the term proportional hazards? There are again some very elegant mathematical results on the proportionality of hazards, and then what we have actually found here is that for many cases, for many models, this proportionality assumption fails. So while constructing the models, I mean, of course, any software package will always give us something, but we also have to ensure that it makes sense and it satisfies some basic sanity checks that need to be performed. So the proportional hazards assumption, which basically means that for two different categories of people, the hazards remain proportional as time progresses. So here the time is of essence here, because we are essentially calculating the probability of time to event. So there are enough and more checks and tests that can be performed on the models that we obtain to determine whether the proportionality assumption in fact holds or not. And there are, of course, other ways by which we can tweak the models in order to ensure that the proportionality assumption is maintained. So these are some technical requirements in order to use this particular model, and then I'll take you through some of them when the need arises. So let's begin with the first definition of over-indebtedness and sacrifice. So how are we actually measuring this? So as you can see from the table here, we have data every month, and we also have the so again, as I told you, the diaries is a very rich data set. So it actually tells us how much a household spent on categories such as milk, pulses, cereals, vegetables, non-vegetarian food, fruits, and so on. So this is now a subjective assumption that we make, that if a household actually spends less than what is expected in the per capita expense in these basic categories. So here we have taken about 11 categories. So if a household sacrifices in each of these 11 categories, then we say that it is over indebted. I should mention here that alcohol and tobacco are also the data on these fields is also mentioned, but we've seen in the data that there are households which have actually sacrificed in all these 11 categories, but have ended up spending a lot of money on alcohol and tobacco. But we also would like to specify that these households are very few. So again, these are subjective decisions. Why is it that you're selecting only these 11 variables, these 11 categories? Why not say 5 of them or 6 of them? Yes, we can do that. That's the flexibility that the event history analysis offers us. And now, where did I get the per capita expense data from? So this is from the NSSO data from 11 and 12. So I should also say that the financial diaries data was collected I think around 2015. So we're not too far off from when the per capita numbers were presented and when the diaries data was collected. So what you see here in the table is the way the data has to be presented to any of the statistical models in order to be able to apply the Cox-PH model and its variants. So you can see here in the rightmost column that we have something known as an event. So because we have considered the sacrifice in 11 categories, so in month one for this particular household, it actually made a sacrifice in all these 11 categories. So we say that this event is now 1. So an event, a household experiences this event. If it does, then the event value takes the number 1, otherwise it's 0, and so on. So I'm just presenting data for 6 months. So we'll essentially have this for all the 12 months for all the households. So this is just a way in which data is presented to the statistical package in order to perform the analysis. Then the next definition that we have is again the standard debt to income ratio. So here we have just taken the plain ratio of the monthly income to the amount that the household spent on repaying its loans versus its monthly income. So again, monthly income here includes all sources except loans, of course. So this could also be income from pensions. It could be income from gifts. It could be income from selling some property or selling some livestock or from agriculture. Irregular income, primary source of income. So we consider the income from all these sources, and what we find here is that so the definition that we have considered here for when an event occurs is if the ratio exceeds 30%. So again, the number can be changed, and the same analysis the same methodology can still be adopted. There are other definitions, which I'm sure many in the audience here would be aware of alternative definitions. So there are definitions we can include we can consider definitions that include depreciation on assets and other metrics that are available. So again, the point that we are trying to make here is how EHA is applicable uh, in order to characterize over-indebtedness, and rather than the definitions themselves. So we have taken a very primitive definition. One is from a consumer protection lens, and the other is from a more quantitative lens. And what we wanted to see was whether the analysis tells us whether these two definitions do converge in some way or the other. Okay, so this is some details on how the data is actually set up before the analysis is performed. So here are some details on the number of such events that have happened in the data set that we have. So here we have categorized some households based on their size. So this is a principle known as stratification in event history analysis. A simple analogy to understand stratification is when you're trying to understand the efficacy of some medicine, we could stratify based on gender. So we will have different survival functions, say for the male gender and different for the female gender. So here we are again. So this is one method, one trick that has been suggested in order that the proportionality assumption is held. So here we have stratified based on household size, and for these particular households, you can see in the rightmost columns on the number of events that have happened. Needless to say, the debt to income ratio, the number of events is much larger, in fact, like order of magnitude higher than the definition of sacrifice. And cumulatively too, there are many events from the debt to income ratio in contrast with the definition of sacrifice. But again, even with the definition of sacrifice, we can see that larger households have experienced this event more often than smaller households. So these are some of the things that we expect the model to actually tell us is what are the characteristics of the households which perhaps influence the event of over-indebtedness. And ultimately, what we would like to say is, can these be models now be used to come up with policy formulations? So we hope that this analysis will actually feed into people who develop policies. Okay? That's what we hope. Okay, so here are the main results that we have. So the standard procedure in data science. So in order to construct the model, we use 70% of the data, and 30% was the holdout set. And here we have taken the covariates or the household characteristics as categorical variables. So we have actually not used numbers, say for example, the magnitude of the shock. So we did not consider them in rupees. Neither did we do that for, say, the monthly income or other expenses. So we simply so we use categorical variables here, and I'm giving you a subset of some of the covariates that we found to be statistically significant. Again, as I told you, there are 150 such variables. I'm guessing. I'm sure you can guess that if we used all 150 of them, we would lead to other technical issues like overfitting and so on. And when the model would also tell us whether which of these covariates or which of these characteristics of the household are statistically significant or not. So we ran through several models, and what I'm reporting here on this slide are those variables which we found to be statistically significant, which means that they can possibly influence. They either have a positive or a negative significant correlation with the event that we are essentially looking at. So the number of income earners, for example, the number of loans that a household has taken, and the slide itself should be self-explanatory. And then the results will give us a little more insight into which of these are actually significant in causing the event of over-indebtedness. Okay. So what we did here was we constructed about four models using the two definitions. So for each definition, we constructed a model with and without stratification. So what I'm presenting to you here is so the graph on the left. I'm hoping that all of you can see the lines that are present in the graph. So this is a plot of the survival function as a function of time. Oh, okay. I have only 5 minutes. All right. Uh, okay. Uh, so these are the survival functions, and this is basically what the EHA would tell us. And here again, I would like to highlight some of the findings from this particular model. So you can also, it also becomes intuitive. Again, the one thing that I would like to show you here, highlight, is that the smaller households have reduced probability of becoming over-indebted with respect to the sacrifice event in comparison with the larger household. But whereas if you take the debt to income ratio, all of them nearly tend to zero, and which is again not surprising given the number of events that we have from the data, irrespective of the household size. So one interesting covariate that we found here was the shocks that a household reports, which is less than 1,000 rupees, actually plays a significant role in a household becoming over indebted. So this is in contrast with, say, large ticket items that the household would actually spend on, say a wedding or an event of some sort. So the smaller ones are actually are what we believe uh, are significant towards household becoming over indebted. Uh, so this is again a result without stratification. So we find that there are actually not too many differences, although for the definition with sacrifice, everything is kind of getting, I mean, there is just one line here. So household size just becomes another covariate. So there is not too much of an insight that we can get with respect to this definition. But with the one for the debt to income ratio definition, they almost look the same. Again, some of the covariates, significant covariates that actually influence this phenomenon. So you can see them on the slide here. So then we actually so having constructed these models, we tested them with household data from the holdout set. So here again we took two cases. So we took households which experienced both types of events, and then next we looked at households that experience only one of these two types of events. So the events of sacrifice or event of higher debt to income ratio. So again, what I'd like to highlight here are the models that we've constructed with respect to the sacrifice definition. They're able to indeed make some difference in the prediction of the time to event probability. So this is for a household with fewer than 3 members. This is 4, 5, and greater than 5. So the green and the black lines, as you can see here, do indicate that the greater households, the probability that they would actually face this phenomenon is higher than a smaller household. So at least for this case, it appears that the model seems to be performing well. So then we looked at the other one where only one of these two types of events actually occurred. So again, here the model of the definition of sacrifice seems to perform well for these households. Again, we did not test it with all the 100 odd households that were in the testing set. We just looked at a few cases, and a quick summary of that is that the definition of debt to income ratio, the results nearly look all the results nearly look the same, except some of the slopes are slightly different for the households with different sizes. But in all cases, the prediction is that yes, this household will ultimately face this definition of over indebtedness. Again, which is not surprising because a considerable number of them do face this definition, do face this event when we use the 30% threshold. Okay, so that's my last slide. I think I have about a minute or so to spare. So what this method allows us to do is, in some sense, allows us to model the financial dynamics of low-income households, because this method allows us to capture changing states of the household, uh, given what the states are. Again, we can also, these models allow us to have multiple events, multiple types of events, recurring events, and so on. So we feel that they're a potent tool in order to be able to study some of the characteristics of low-income households. Again, there are more questions that we felt could be answered at the end of this. So we used only categorical variables. Had we used actual numbers, would the results have changed? What if we had linear couplings, nonlinear interaction terms between several of the covariates? So here we just took them all as a linear combination of these data points. What if we actually had nonlinear effects? Would things have changed? Again, now this is a question to all the framers of policy. So suppose one had access to both these models, which one would they select? So I'd just like to spur more debate into some of these aspects of the usage of such data science related models in policy formulation. Good, thank you. That's all I have, and I think I'm well within time. Yeah.
Yeah, you absolutely are. Thank you
Okay.
so much, Sachit, for your wonderful presentation. It is clearly important to understand the factors indicating over-indebtedness in households before extending further credit to ensure their survival and well-being. So thank you for that. I would now like to invite Nishant Kumar, Head of Social Protection Initiative and Research Analytics at Dvara Research, to present his work on income distribution and inequality in India. Nishant, you have 20 minutes for your presentation. Over to you.
Hey, Neti, just sound check and also just on the presentation. Can you see?
Yes.
Can you see my presentation?
Yes, I can see your presentation. I can also hear you.
Okay, good, great, perfect. And just wanted to know if it's in presentation. Okay, cool. This one. Okay, thanks a lot. So thanks, Neti, and also thanks, Sachit. That was really a cool presentation. So So my name is Nishant. I work at Dvara Research. I'm the head of research analytics here, and I also head the social protection initiative. So I'm going to present in a paper that I co-authored with Dr. Anand Sasar now. He couldn't make it today, but I'm doing it. Presenting this paper along with him. This is. Sorry. Okay, good. This is a present, and like I said, this is a paper on income distributions and inequality in India, data from 2014 to 19, currently under review for some publications. But a version of the paper can be found on SSR in our archive in case anybody has found something interesting or couldn't follow a part of my presentation. Please do find the paper online. Essentially, this paper is about trying to understand some aspects of the evolution of income in India across this time period, but also to try and just show you some of the distributional aspects of income in India, just across some basic cuts, right? So around what is the income distribution like, and how has it grown, how has it changed over time across states, rural, urban, occupations, caste, etc. That's the broad kind of idea of what the paper tries to cover. Paper also tries to cover, which I will hopefully get into my presentation, is just a kind of introduction into a methodology that could be used to understand inequality in a different sense, inequality in the sense of how reallocation of incomes is happening across the income distribution in India, how resources are being, or how we can measure if resources are being transferred from richer households to poorer households, or vice versa. And that kind of is the major contribution of the paper. Really is in that methodological sense. So I will construct the kind of go through the paper in kind of two parts. One is I'll just show you some interesting pictures for anybody who's interested just on the income distribution, how it's built across India. And the second part is I'll go through some of the methodological parts of the decomposition of inequality into understanding how reallocation happens within the distribution. So a lot of technical terms, but I promise you it becomes simple as we go along. Just to give you a couple of heads up, the data is from CMI CPHS, the Consumer Pyramids Household Survey. So data on income is constructed at a per capita level, but it's kind of got from household survey. So we have household incomes which we convert into per capita incomes for the purpose of this analysis, only because it kind of helps us merge it with results from other studies that have studied income inequality. But very much we're using the whole of the household's income as an understanding of where income comes from and not just from occupations. It's from 2014 to 19. Yes, we're planning to update the paper with 2020, where we hope to see some. I mean, I believe we'll see some fireworks, but regardless of that, I think it would be interesting. It was an interesting exercise to go through what income distribution looked like from 14 to 19. This is the period available from CPHS for us. Just to give you kind of a heads up on the results, is kind of from the income distribution analysis is nothing new for anybody who's followed this space. For us, it's easier to understand that there have been real income losses at the bottom of the income distribution, which means there have been real income losses for really poor households, and in losses in both shares and in growth rates. So there are about, to give, as I put on the slide, 41% decline in income share of the bottom ventile, which is the bottom 5 tile or 5 percentile of the income distribution, which is a marginal reduction in shares, but when you do calculate how it kind of declines, it's a significant amount. And then there's also like a real loss in terms of income, where you have the bottom 5 tile also having a negative growth rate of 5.5% over these time. So broadly, it's just showing us that there is some real income loss at the bottom of the income distribution. This is predominantly a rural phenomenon coming from small and marginal farmers or the informal labor sectors that constitute a lot of this bottom ventile that we are focused on in understanding not just the ventile, but the bottom half of the distribution. I'm just showing you the results for the ventile because they seem to kind of give you a sense of where the distribution is at. And the larger point is that the income reallocation, which was surprising for us, has been decreasing from 2015 and even turned negative in 2018, which means there was a regime shift where studying the distribution showed us that income shares have gone up for the higher income percentiles and gone down for the low income percentiles. And that's something that's not happened before in India, and something that we get to. Okay, so yeah, as I said, 2 parts to the presentation. First part is just quickly, I'll run you through some interesting pictures. I won't have all time because we are short on time. I have the time to go through all of the kind of different aspects of each of these pictures, but I'll just point you towards interesting aspects of each of the pictures that I'm going to show you. The first one I'm just showing you is just a picture of how the distribution of income is, and try to highlight the aspect of what is currently inequality at. We use a measure called the K index or the Kolkata index to show inequality. K index is an alternative to Gini. If you want to understand in its essence, it's just much more intuitive measure of inequality. And that shows us that it's about constant between 2014 and 19, which is understandable. You won't see surprisingly large jumps in inequality in such short periods of time. And it's around 0.65, 0.66 for the entire income distribution of India, which essentially just means that 65% of the population, 35% of the population is earning 65% of all income, right? So I said it's just a generalization of the Pareto 80-20 rule. Anybody's familiar with that? But and just to show you, to focus on the top line in the picture is to show you that how far away the top decile in income earners are in terms of contributing to share of the total income of the country, as opposed to the other kind of deciles. And just a preliminary picture, nothing too surprising for us, but just to know the extent of inequality as it is currently in this time period, right? So that's on shares. If I move on to understanding growth rates, this is more interesting. This is something where we use growth incidence curves to understand what is the compounded annual growth of average growth rate of average annual incomes, right, of households within this period. And on the x-axis, you see the income distribution, right? So what I would like you to focus on is just on the left-hand side of the picture, which shows that the bottom decile, the last 2 ventiles, if you will, are significant, showing very, very small low rates of growth. Specifically, the bottom ventile is kind of having a negative CAGR, which means that there's been, as I said in the beginning, there's been a negative growth rate of incomes at the bottom of the income distribution. And this is all weighted for kind of real, weighted with the inflation. It's inflation index, so you have real prices. At real prices, these are kind of the compound growth rates. And this is again something that's interesting, because we saw the reduction in shares, and we see a reduction in the growth rates of income. And for some of us, you would be wondering, because this period of 14 to 19 is a period that we've shown remarkable growth. We see this kind of very much the underlying idea of increasing inequality at the bottom parts of the income distribution, right? So, and further decomposing this, at least at the growth rate picture, into rural and urban, we understand that a lot of this negative growth rate actually comes from rural households at the bottom of the income distribution. So you see, if you decompose it to rural and urban, you see the blue line, which represents rural households. The bottom decile is again at negative CAGR, which is surprising, and for all of us working in this space is something that's really worrisome. We're not talking about a long time ago. We're talking about periods just in the last 5-6 years. As contrary to that, the urban picture, while not quite spectacular, it's still much better, and in a kind of showing a positive trend where growth rates at the bottom of the income distribution are higher than at the top, and that seems to be a more progressive. There seems to be more progressive reallocation, the urban sectors as opposed to rural sectors. Okay, so I won't go too much into detail about this, but the idea, if we just do occupational and caste cuts, it's kind of very natural for us to something that I also flagged earlier, is that a lot of this comes from small and marginal farmers, farm sector, and the informal labor sector, and as understandably so, the SC, ST, and OBC castes are the ones that are predominantly forming the bottom ventiles of the income distribution. So more to infer from these pictures. There are lots for us to understand and decipher, but the overarching pictures of understanding the income distribution show us that there are reducing income shares at the bottom of the distribution, which are predominantly due to rural, informal sector, farm sector households, who also are part of traditionally overburdened or discriminated castes. Okay, so these are kind of the. I apologize for rushing through, but I just wanted to showcase that, and for a lot of you who've kind of worked or studied this space before, it's not something that's new for you to kind of. That's not something extremely new for you. You would understand that. What was just most surprising is a lot of that just comes from the last 5 years of it, and it's not something that we take a historical perspective on, which is to say that there has not been a lot of improvement in the income distribution. In fact, what I will show you is how do we sort of sense which direction changes in inequality are taking. So this is kind of the second part of the presentation, where we focus on understanding the income distribution and how we can model it. And the idea was just using a method that was, I think, first introduced by researchers at the London Mathematical Laboratory, like Berman, Peters, and that. So we use a model called the geometric Brownian motion with reallocation, or RGBM model. The idea is very much to break down income and income distributions as a log normal distribution, something that conforms to what a log normal distribution, which we can surprisingly find in a lot of economic processes currently that are being studied. And we use the geometric Brownian motion process, simple geometric Brownian motion process, to study it with the addition of a reallocation term. The reallocation term is just something that's added in to kind of make it a more realistic model of income. So to just take you through the basics of the indication, you have on the left hand side, you have change in income of a particular individual or individual household over time, and then you have two components of the income, which is one is the systemic component and the other is an idiosyncratic component. You can kind of make different analogies to understand what could be systemic components of income, which could, education, etc. And then there's the idiosyncratic components of income, which is more to do with, the current market out there, or opportunities that are available, etc. Which is very basic stochastic components, right? So, and then you have the reallocation parameter, which is just for you to see if whether an individual is, in this case we use different thresholds. In this case, it's the mean national income, right? So if an individual is earning above the mean national income, you have an amount that the individual sends back to the distribution, right? To the nation in some sense. So you're a net giver to the economy, as opposed to if you were somebody below the mean average income, you would be a net receiver of some component of reallocation, right? So it's just a simple threshold to sense whether or not if you are above a particular threshold of income, you are a giver of income. You give a part of your income back to the country through redistribution. A typical example is tax, although there are multiple other kind of mechanisms where redistribution happens, which may not be kind of visible to us. And then you have somebody, if you say as somebody earning very lower levels of income, much below the national average, you could sense that they're a net beneficiary or a receiver of some component of income from because net recipient some additional income. So which is why if that xi minus xn is positive, you get a reduction in your income, actual income, and then if xi minus xn is negative, you get an additional amount to your that supplements your income because you are earning lesser than the average. So this is the idea of reallocation. The understanding is that it's not perfectly modeled incomes, but it just gives you a more realistic picture than the logarithmic distribution or the kind of basic geometric model, right? So what is most interesting and what is the kind of chief component of a lot of the analysis that we have done, and also the kind of literature that's building around this, is that this tau, which is what we're calling as reallocation parameters, is something that's significantly important for us and could prove to be something important to understand what state is the income distribution at what regime it is at. So if tau is it can take three possible values: 0, positive, or negative, right? So if it's 0, the idea is that you have the term wipes out, and you have generally just a geometric Brownian motion, which if evolved over a long period of time, you have almost like perfect inequality, which means that over time you will have one individual. If it goes to infinite time, you will have one individual who holds all of the income, and then the rest who hold nothing, or one group that holds all of the income, rest holds nothing. So as you can see, the first picture on the bottom panel is just something that just shows two lines, two black lines, which you could just think about as one line which refers to the top income decile and the other as the bottom decile, and they just separate because there is no kind of no reallocation happening. It's just people are earning higher, keep earning higher. The tails become much fatter, and the log normal peak almost converges to 0. So in technical terms, you'll have kind of no stationary non-zero distribution that this converges to, right? As opposed to, you have the tau positive regime, which is the middle picture in the middle panel here, which is that as we had talked about, there is a net recipient of additional income who is someone below the general income mean income, and then who is somebody who's a net provider, a spender of for whose income is deducted, and then they're supplemented into the distribution. So you see the two black lines are almost close together. There is still obviously a difference, and that will depend on parameter tau itself and the value that it has. But in terms of regimes, it's just a regime where you have a reduction in inequality over time between the top decile and the bottom decile. They move together. Then you have the very interesting case, which we thought at some point would just be theoretical, but it's in fact not. It's just the idea of tau being negative, which is, if you were to conform to cliches, it's just the idea of rich getting richer, poor getting poorer, right? So the idea is that if tau is negative, the second half of the term on the equation, second half of the equation would just become inverted, which means if you are above a particular threshold of income, you become a receiver of additional income, and if you are below the threshold, you would be a spender of additional income, which in essence mean that you're not only earning less, but you spend money that goes back into the distribution and possibly to the top of the distribution, or to the right hand side. And that's essentially the understanding of the regimes of tau is where we believe will give us a better understanding of where is our kind of income distribution at, and that's a very important parameter for us to understand the situation in which the country or the national income distributions or subnational income distributions would be at, and also gives us a good sense of a test of whether or not the different mechanisms for redistribution that we're considering now are working, right? And at the end of the day, I think while we can go into specifics and the kind of properties of tau and how it behaves at subnational levels, all of that, I think the most important thing for us to take away for us, at least in this, is just to understand and use this tau as a better kind of monitoring tool for us to understand what state is the country at, and also helps us to understand which regime are we currently at. Just to show you a little bit of the results of what that looks like. So you have the top, on the left hand side, you have the RGBM model and the results of the RGBM model, which is, you see that the model kind of fits the actual data almost really well, except for the top 10%, which is understandable. In fact, the model underestimates the top income decile.
Nishant, hi.
Yeah.
I'm really sorry to rush you, but could you please wrap up in the next 2 minutes?
Yeah, sure.
Thank you.
And on the right hand side, we have something which just shows you kind of how has tau evolved over time, and you have the idea that tau actually goes negative in different parts of 2017, 18, 17 and 18 for at least the rural economy and for the national level. Previous work, I think by Anand and Henrik Jensen in 2020 also shows you kind of from data that was available from Piketty and Chancel and the World Inequality Index. It's not just now, that since early 2000s that we've had a kind of negative reallocation regime. That may have been the case for us, and that kind of constitutes a longer term problem that we are seeing the economy take. Okay, so quickly, just to wrap up, this is obviously just to point out that this is not the case for all states. If you think about the nation as kind of the configuration of different kind of states, you have some states that don't take this negative tau kind of regime, and some states that do take it. So Tamil Nadu and UP are presented as examples, purely examples, while there are many other states we could kind of study as just two kind of opposites in terms of regimes they're at. So in Tamil Nadu, you see the kind of percentiles of income, the CAGR is having a more positive trend, which means the incomes are rising at the lower end of the income distribution, and growth rates are negative at the higher end of the income distribution, and whereas in UP it's the exact opposite. Okay, so just to wrap up and maybe just take half a minute to just say that this is kind of the work, it's kind of validates a lot of our thinking around what's happening, who are these low income households that we should be worried about, the increase, the informal labor, rural households, that we constantly see household finance being kind of working on, and we think about different interventions and all of those exciting research already being presented. It's also important for us to understand what does this mean in the larger picture. It's just currently all these redistribution mechanisms don't seem to be working, and really needs a rethink for us in the context of policy solutions, right? So and also about how well what we take away from each of these different interventions that we're thinking about, whether the financial, non-financial, government transfers, taxation policy, whatever it is. It's just not coming together. So that's kind of what we wanted to highlight and what our future work is going to be on. So I'll stop there and give it back to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Nishant, for throwing light on the increasing gap in income inequality over time and the negative growth in income shares of the bottom income quintiles, especially in the rural segments. It was an excellent presentation. Thank you. These presentations bring us to our next question about the use case of applied data science in the field of, sorry, can everybody please mute their mics? Thank you. So yeah, these presentations bring us to our next question about the use case of applied data science in the field of household finance research. To reflect on this question, I would like to invite Dr. Nandan Sudarsanam from IIT Madras. Dr. Sudarsanam, it would be great if you could give your overall takeaways from the two presentations and some examples from your own field of work. You have 15 minutes for this discussion. Over to you.
Hi, Niyati. Hello, everyone. Thank you. Am I audible? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Perfect. Hey, so great. So Niyati, I just want to step off script a little bit over here. I think a lot of exciting work has been discussed over not just today's session, but over the last 2 to 3 days on the applied data science track. And so, again, it really depends on the time we have and the audience. I wanted to do two things, and maybe I can just bring up my slide as I speak with you. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yeah, now I can.
Okay, so I wanted to do two things, and you tell me if you'll have the time for it. One was I just thought, depending on the audience, whether it would be of value at all, if I could just maybe, since I've been involved with many of these projects through their evolution, just an overarching summary of the 5 projects that we've had in the applied data science track, and maybe a few thoughts on research direction. Again, if the topics have been fairly fresh in everyone's mind, I can skip the overview and maybe just talk on research direction. However, if you feel that it would benefit the participants and the listeners to have a, maybe a 5-minute summary of all the topics, then I could do that as well. I'll take your suggestion on this.
As you wish, actually. I mean, it's completely all right if you also give like an overall takeaway from both the presentations. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, well, I think let me at least just maybe then not jump too deep into each individual topic. So I've been involved and we've listened to at least 5, research presentations that cover the applied data science and household finance track. And we've seen really interesting, really interesting problems that were covered, both in terms of the methodologies that people have been looking at, the data sources, as well as the actual, problem statement. In some sense, what does the research throw light on? So, ranging all the way from, for instance, the work that we saw with Priya and Shreya, talking about, socioeconomic determinants of household investment portfolio. Broadly, this notion that can I look at a household structure and determine portfolios, right? So one very interesting question that always comes up, and this makes for great pop sci or popular economics kind of writing also is we all know that the quantum and quantum of expense or quantum of assets and income and so on are just completely different between low income and high income households, but is the portfolio itself as a percentage fundamentally different, right? And it kind of links to this essential notion of necessities, and luxuries. And so I thought this was a very interesting body of work where you take physical and financial assets and say, hey, can I not just talk about the quantum, but can I also talk about the portfolio itself and look to see if what socioeconomic factors can actually look at the composition, right? We saw some very interesting work from Flame University with Reshmi and Debashish, which looked at both financial savings as well as portfolio choice on health-seeking behavior, right? I think this particular body of research led to a lot of really interesting research discussions we've had along the way, because when you look at rural and when you look at low-income households, the decision, both of these, rural and low-income households have historically had access in some way or the other to finance and health without institutional existence of finance and health, right? So even before a hospital is there exists some kind of an informal mechanism for healthcare, whether we think it's good or not, or whatever it is. But either way, these are two great examples of how an institutional existence of something, whether it's a formal healthcare facility or whether it's a financial service provider in the form of a bank, and is there a relationship between the behavior of seeking institutional support in a place which is primarily dominated by informal support, is, I think, a very interesting question. And in this particular study, of course, they were a little more focused, right? Which is to say, hey, is your financial saving and portfolio choice itself in some way a predictor, or can it imply that you are going to show some kind of health-seeking behavior, right? One, perhaps because you already have the predilection towards adopting or seeking an institutional support, but perhaps also does the fact that you have this kind of a particular portfolio enable you to reach out to a healthcare provider, right? We saw some interesting work on the notion of gold. Gold is this really important discussion whenever we come to low income, right? Whether it's urban or rural, we're all well aware of how gold plays such a pivotal role culturally in the Indian context. And so the approach taken in this study has been to see if we can take a little bit more of an econometric approach to kind of look at the portfolio of Markowitz portfolio theory and other models to kind of see whether it makes sense, primarily from a point of view of diversification and growth. So what should theoretically the role of gold be in a household portfolio, particularly in a low-income household? From Sachit and Navita, we just heard, who we just heard from earlier today. We've been talking about the over-indebted behavior, and particularly this on over-indebtedness from a temporal sense, and that's what I think makes this study different from the other studies that we've been looking at. We're all used to, in a very data science perspective, a very 101 exercise that we give in our classes is, will a person go delinquent or not? Will a person default or not? And often these are treated very much like a cross-sectional data set. However, one conception that kind of what makes this a slightly different problem is to say that it's not that you will go you will be over indebted or not. It's a question of when will you become over indebted. So it is really important to look at this not as a not to lose the resolution and say person will get over indebted in the next month, but just to instead say, is there some kind of a trajectory and a likelihood function over time that leads to over indebtedness? And that's what event history analysis and survival analysis in general support. And a lot of interesting discussions we've been having with Sachit and Navita have been of, hey, how do you model this problem of it's a question of when and not a question of if? So you start believing that it's merely a point of time by when something happens. Then how do you start modeling and classifying on those bases? Finally, again, and this is, by the way, put together in no order, but we just heard from Nishant on this, again, fascinating study on income inequality, but the evolution specifically of income inequality over time, and particularly what that translates to in the lowest ventile, right? So obviously, income inequality itself might be a changing phenomena, but even there is a lot to be learned if you go into each minor strata and see what's happening there. So I think overall, I just wanted to kind of summarize, because not everybody who might have joined today might have been there yesterday, but this is some of the really exciting work that I've had the pleasure of being a part of, even perhaps as an outsider, in just learning about some of these exciting problems and the varied approaches that we see towards them. I want to take maybe the next 5 to 10 minutes and share with you some of my extremely subjective biases. And so please understand, take this with this caveat. But I just thought I'll talk to you a little bit about what I think is exciting and meaningful as a research direction in this field, right? And this is purely what, again, like I said, it's entirely subjective. What I think might be a lot of fun also in this field. So one area that I think has a lot of potential is in causal modeling. It's already becoming a little bit of a buzzword, perhaps not big enough in the field of data science. But I'm of the personal opinion that a causal understanding in household finance or in developmental economics more broadly is extremely important, and particularly important in this field, even in contrast to other fields. And I think there are a few reasons for this. And so I would be really excited to, I for one would like to work in this area, and it would be great to see other practitioners and academics working in this area. And the reason I say this is because unlike many other fields, the nature of the current data availability and the future data availability is very limited in household finance. I say limited in a very relative sense, right? It is not to say that that effort should not be made, and I think that effort should be made in terms of more systematically and carefully gathering and learning that is the only way forward. But you will always be limited in a way that other fields are not limited. So for instance, if you take something like, as someone who works in data science and other fields, if you take something like IT or e-commerce, or why go that far? Even in finance, suppose I take something like capital markets, right? A lot of that exists right now on the digital landscape, and is extremely amenable to big data. It's amenable to vast volumes of data that are seamlessly gathered and therefore can be worked upon by data science. So there exists a certain level of, how do I put it, perhaps arrogance, when one chooses to say, I don't really need to understand why something works. I can get away with knowing that these are associated or these are correlated, right? Whereas out here, I don't really see, for instance, I mean, even you take something like manufacturing, right? Like the transformations that we see are in fields like IoT or Internet of Things, where you can slap a sensor onto pretty much anything. And, even if manufacturing historically did not have this kind of data capabilities, it can now.
Dr.
Whereas,
Sudarsana,
yeah.
Can you please, I'm really sorry to rush you, but can you
Sure.
please wrap up in the next 2 minutes?
Yeah, I think 2 minutes is what I would need. That would be perfect. No problem.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. So I guess, one thought is that this notion of causal understanding is imperative in this field. Also, thanks to the ethics of decision making, the implications of decision making, and also the fact that we are dealing with human beings and their decisions, right? So we can ask them why we did something. Now, in pushing towards a causal understanding, I see two broad approaches. One is a data-centric one and a model-centric one. And I hope just sharing these two directions can motivate researchers towards these areas. One, of course, is that experimental data. That in data science, we have this hierarchy of survey data, and then observational or transactional data, and finally experimental data. And somewhere experimental data is seen as the bottom line in terms of being able to say A caused B rather than A is correlated with B. And it comes with a lot of challenges. It comes with a lot of difficulties. People are inherently against the notion of experimenting. I've given a small article that I think is interesting. So even when there is a lot of money to be made, people will hesitate. But thankfully, that thinking is changing. I mean, it's not too long ago, we just had the Nobel Prize for Duflo and Banerjee. So this is coming back in style again. And so one very exciting thing would be to really see if we can move towards experimental data, which is even beyond this notion of primary data collection if it's observational. But experimental data means you go systematically and purposefully change settings in specific places to create the data rather than systematically observing the data, right? And a lot of very interesting problems can be solved at the data layer rather than the methodology layer. Of course, on the methodology layer, there has been almost a life's long work by Judea Pearl and his lab towards causality. So there's a new theory of causal and counterfactual inference based on structural models, something that many people have been working on. And what this does so beautifully is differentiates between associations, interventions, and counterfactuals, all of which are extremely important if you're going to make meaningful conclusions in this field. And the way it does this is to bring the insights of the practitioner, the subject matter expert, or the human being into the loop, and to create these kind of beliefs about how variables are interconnected to each other. So there is a little bit of expertise coming in and working with the experimental data or working with data to make meaningful conclusions on causations. So these are the only 2 points that I had, and I think these are 2 very exciting directions that might be pertinent to household finance research. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Sudarsana, for your wonderful insights, especially about the experimental approaches, as we at Dvara have recently begun to do some work on that front. So thank you for that. I would now request Mr. Ram Kumar Ratna, Business Head of Tamil Nadu at Dvara KGFS, to carry this conversation forward and give us his overall take on how these findings can be applied to the kind of work they do at Dvara KGFS. Mr. Ratna, you have 10 minutes. This conversation will be followed by a 10-minute Q&A session. In the meantime, audience, please feel free to write your questions in the chat box. Mr. Ratnam, over to you.
Yeah, thank you. I thank the research team for giving me an opportunity to come out and speak here. So last 4 days were jam-packed on research, so I thought let me put on the screen. I'm not propaganding any product, but let's see, have we put whatever we heard into practice? So I just want to have a screen. I will share the screen. Okay, the screen is visible, right? Hello?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I will just stick on to the timing, okay? I have put the data science usage into financial institutions in 3 parameters. One is, what do we do when we do an onboarding of a customer? Does data science help there? Are we doing enough while we engage with the customer on the household finance? How are we looking at data? What are the engagement platforms we have? And how do we look at data science to strengthen the day-to-day process? Okay. I'm touching on KGFS. See, today we are all governed by self-regulatory organization, and everybody has got some platform which we talk to each other. So most of them who are working on MFIs will do a rather share of knowledge. So today what we have done in KGFS is that we onboard a customer on a scoring methodology.
Mr. Ratnam, sorry to interrupt. Could you please open your slide sharing?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, it's visible now?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, so what I was saying is that when we onboard a customer today for the small loans, micro enterprise loan, we kind of onboard with a score. The score is basically based on demographic and repayment behavior. Since I have little time, I will keep telling, and people can ask questions at the end. So apart from scoring, what we have done is we have got into a dynamic cash flow analysis. What do you mean by dynamic cash flow analysis? Is that today you go to a household and ask a person how much you earn. They say I earn around, if it is a daily 400, 500, or if it is a month. But on a dynamic cash flow application, we get more information from the customer. Suppose it's a tailor. We get to understand how many women's saris, blouses she stitches, what are the other kind of stitching she does, and we marry to find out the income, because they're all people who are at the bottom bar of the pyramid, and education, though they are 8 to 10 qualified, sometimes on income streams they might not be that expert. So we kind of get into understanding the complete picture of what is the earning and then fill in, and it becomes dynamic. Now, going forward, we are saying that we will do a psychometric test for the customers whom we are onboarding. It is not in place now, but we are thinking about it. We also have a mechanism by which we will identify the fraud patterns. One example we are saying is that defaulter, MFI frequent hopper. I had a classic case where somebody had come to various financial institutions and a high mark report was fired 21 times for the customer. So which means clearly the customer's intention to pay just to get a loan is what was there. And the last one, and this is the customer financial well-being, wherein we have Dr. Nandan is there. We just take the goals of the customer, simple goals, and we offer product of wealth management. We are talking about data science today, but from 2008, we have been talking on engaging with the customer with the data science. Our financial well-being report is the key for a discussion with the customer, and it is driven by plan, grow, protect, diversify discussion. What we typically do is once the customer gets onboarded, we collect income, expenses, assets, liabilities, and we get to know the entire household well. I'm proud to say that as an NBFC, we collect all details of the household, and we understand the household better. We don't stop there. We just go to understand what are all the goals of the customer, and how does the customer try and reach the goal, whether the customer will be able to reach the goal or not. For example, I'm just taking a financial well-being report of Manjula Murugayan. Manjula Murugayan has been with us since 2012. She has got a joint liability loan with us and an enterprise loan with us. Now, how does data work here? When I speak to Manjula as a wealth manager, I understand what are all her goals. If you look at here, we have plotted the goals here. She has 2 daughters, and priority is daughter's marriage. Then you have house renovation. Then the plan graph for us is quite 200 years, of which we talk about retirement, how much a corpus would require if some person Hello?
Yeah, I wasn't
just
sure
got
if it
cut.
was just me, but I got cut as well.
I also got cut. Yeah, because of the timing or something. I don't know.
No. You can start. Sorry.
Screen is visible?
Yes.
So coming back, so where we are is audible, right?
Yeah, the goals. The next
Yeah.
slide.
Yeah. So coming back to Manjula had various goals. And will she be able to meet the goals or not will be the discussion the wealth manager does with Manjula based on the income expenditure that has been captured and also the obligation for loan. How does it help? If I'm a customer and if I know I have a set of goals, with the current scheme of things, will I be able to meet the goals? If not, the wealth manager talks about growth. Under the growth, he talks about various things. The first thing which he talks is about high cost loan. High cost loan here would mean borrowing from money lenders and neighbors at a high cost. So that's the first thing he will talk. Then he will talk about idle assets utilization. He will talk about reducing expenses and things like that. He will ensure that he speaks the language of finance to the customer to ensure that the goal is by and large met. And we know that we are very interested in the customer's life, and hence we also talk about protection. And this is data science driven because the protection capital value is calculated by an algorithm at the back end based on the income expenses of the family. Interestingly, after 46, if it is a labor, this has worked in such an extent that a drop in the wage of the labor after 45 age is also put in system, so that the customer gets comfort to understand will he or she have a corpus during retirement. That's the data level at which we work on. And we have also introduced a nudge engine based on the data we have. Now we have gone back to our fleet on street wealth managers and branch managers saying that, hey, this customer started with joint liability, but there was an opportunity. Now she is running a shop, she has got a livestock. How do we go and see to that the growth story of that family is taken care? There we kind of look at enterprise loans because we have all the data, and customers are talked about the new product arrival based on the nudge, and the customers are wanting to foray into financial well-being. The other one which I said on data science is about strengthening process. There was a discussion day before yesterday on how do you go to a place where it is not financially included either on savings or on credit. Interestingly, what we do is we do a geotag of the house. We also do get to understand the customer's KYC, then fire a report and find that if there is nobody who has gone, that is the place we actually go. That's how we started remote rural concept in Dvara, and that helped. So we have done that as good as 2016 when I was in Krishnagiri, that there was a hill which was never which was never looked at by MFI, but the data helped us to see that we can go there and start looking at community for helping in terms of protection and their financial well-being. And how does a timely report on data helps? We could understand that if the customer is actually in need, as I keep meeting the customer is in need of some small emergency loan or top-up loan, she's struggling to kind of meet an emergency expense. That helps through the data. And we have put everything under one pack which says that data governance. And the last slide is about data and digital. Today, we all talk about digital. How do I use data for digital is very important. We know the customer's KYC, Aadhaar fact. We also know we do disbursement out of NEFT. And if the account is Aadhaar seeded, we try and move the customer to digital. We have all the data. The second is we are in the process of getting to understand whether the customer household has a smartphone. There we can use the UPI payment, new age also in terms of Google Pay, ATM, phone banking. We help them to do it by themselves. A kid in the family, we teach them how to do it. The third module is about even if you have a feature phone, we have a facility by which we can do an SMS trigger. Even the husband has it, the SMS trigger is valid for 24 months. You just have to link it and you can pay it through your bank. The last one is the typical NEFT transfer, which can be sat at home and did. What the Prime Minister Jan Dhan Yojana gave as account, now we are trying to use it for our digital applications to go forward. So to put the long story short, I think data is critical for a financial institution, and as we go, as we go step up year after year, the data can be mined, used well, and that can be put into various usage by the fleet and also by the organization. Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Ratnam, for your insights. It is very interesting to see how data science is already being used by FSPs to cater to the specific needs of the customers. Your reflections will also hopefully pave way for the advancement of this field to help strengthen the agenda of financial inclusion. The floor is now open for questions. So, like due to shortage of time, I would actually just take a few questions and we can maybe take a short break after that. So the first question is for IIIT Bangalore, and there are a few clarificatory questions from certain audience, like who's following us on the live stream. Also before that, yeah, okay. So the first question is, what all is a basic expenditure composed of? And let me just ask 2 or 3 more clarificatory questions at once, and you can maybe take them all together. So also Amar Behel asks, what was the frequency of visit to the 400 households during the 12 months, and who has collected the data, and what's the range of income of households? Is it like 5,000 to 10,000 per month?
The first one about expenses, there are many fields. Apart from the 11 basic categories that we looked at, there was also alcohol and tobacco, and also on events and weddings, funerals, school fees, or medical expenses, and so on. Frequency with which data was collected, it's once every month for 12 months. So the paper that I had cited there, which is by colleagues from Dvara, so that has all the details about the distribution of the incomes and so on. So we do find that some of them have a steady income of about, some of them do have a steady income of about 10,000-12,000 rupees a month. And for quite a few others, it's very irregular. There are in the time period that we looked at, there were several months where they did not have any income at all. In some cases, it may have gone up all the way up to more than 10,000. In some cases, barely a few thousands. And even the number of income earners also sometimes changes from month to month. So it's not like there is considerable variation in income that we find for many households. So sometimes there are people who nobody has a job. Sometimes you have more than 2-3 people who are working and who have access to income.
Right, thank you. Sonali Garg asks, is the income used only self-reported?
Everything is self-reported. I don't think there is any bureau data that is present there. This also includes data on savings and deposits, so which we actually had some difficulties in wrapping our heads around on how to actually use it. So at least from what we gather from the paper which describes this data set, everything is self-reported and it's from recall. So we were also advised which data fields are more believable than others, because sometimes there's a tendency to underreport or overreport, or maybe not even remember correctly what was there.
Right, thank you. Then there's another question by Amar Behel, who asks, is there any relation with overfunding by MFI and end use of loan is not well established other than consumption loan? Some part should be productive use to have positive cycle of income. It's more like a comment itself, and basically he's just asking about your thoughts onto like some of the policy implications and how.
So,
yeah.
See, what we have seen with many of the households that we looked at is there is a strong time correlation between an event in the family and when a loan was taken. So, for instance, a wedding next month, or some such thing next month, and then there was so a loan would either have been taken the previous month or something. And there are people who have taken it, for instance, for house repair, to repair something. Again, so it's like what Dr. Nandan was also saying about the causality. Now that is something that has to be established. Did they take a loan? Was it finally used for this purpose? You have multiple sources, so it's very difficult to actually say that yes, the loan was taken here. We can at most establish some time correlation, nothing more.
Right. Thanks a lot. Then the next question is for Nishant by Amar Behr. So he asks, there are a few parts of the question, so I'm just going to break them down one by one. The first part is real income taken as inflation impact or also expense set off. Nishant, I can't hear you if you're trying to say
Sorry. No, I was just saying I don't fully answer the question, but I'm just saying that, yeah, we inflation indexed using CPI at different levels at all cuts that we have data for, and at all levels that you have inflation indices for. So it's very much real income that we're looking at. Nominal income, you don't expect, to see that as big shifts as we saw. But nonetheless, I think we're using kind of very conservative estimates. But yeah, I can share the paper on the chat for anybody who's interested on more details about how the distribution is constructed.
Right, thank you. He also asks, basically what all income categories does the income that you take include? So does it also include government subsidy, Manrega income, also like along with the primary income of households?
Yes, absolutely. So the CPHS panel, as you know, Niyati, is just complete. What we use is complete household income, which is all sources, including private transfers, remittances, transfers from government, anything that the household has as an income, and not just as wage, but as an income in terms of cash flow. We consider that.
Right. And then there's a final question wherein he asks, is there any role of debt which has been measured along with income?
Fascinating question, but that's something I think we would love to kind of do more of. I think at this point we're just looking at income, but then as one of the points of the paper say that we don't really know what is contributing to this negative reallocation parameter. So it could be debt, it could just be unregulated prices of services, it could be just higher standards of living. We just don't know what the underlying reasons are, and that kind of talks back to some of these interventions and the kind of research that Nandan was alluding to. We need more of that, but the idea of the paper was just to see, okay, can we have a metric that helps us identify which regime are we at as a country?
Right. Thanks, Nishant. And due to shortage of time, I won't be taking any further questions. However, there's just one tiny comment that Amabel also wants to, make on your study itself. He says that extension of this for the last 15 months, based on the COVID impact, etc., will also be highly insightful, given the kind of situation that the pandemic has put all of us in. So that's that. We would now take a short break and resume at 5:45 for our final session for the day. So stay tuned. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye. Welcome back, everyone. Thanks a lot for staying on. I would like to introduce Dr. Tarun Ramaduroy. Who has joined us today for the closing keynote speech. Dr. Tarun Ramaduroy is a professor of financial economics at Imperial College London. He also serves as an editor of the Review of Financial Studies and is a research fellow of CEPR, a senior academic fellow of the Asian Bureau of Finance and Economics Research, and a non-resident senior fellow at the National Council of Applied Economic Research. Dr. Ramaduroy has also served in a range of policy roles in addition to his academic work, including the chairperson of the Interregulatory Committee on Household Finance constituted by the RBI, visiting scholar at the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister of India, and economic advisor to the European Securities and Markets Authority. Please welcome Dr. Tarun Ramaduroy for his talk titled Household Finance, Short-Term Financial Needs and Long-Term Financial Resilience. Dr. Ramaduroy, over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen. That's all right.
Sure.
Yeah. Can you see that?
Yes.
Great. Okay. Right. So thank you for giving me the chance to address this forum. The research conference looks like it's been going extremely well. I should, before I begin, thank several collaborators for helping me pull this slideshow together, most importantly, Christine Badarinza at the National University of Singapore. So what I want to do in this talk is to sort of refresh your memory about the RBI Committee on Household Finance, the interregulatory committee that I chaired, that submitted and had its report published in 2017, where we benchmarked Indian households against those in other major world markets, and did a lot of work on sort of trying to understand whether Indian households behaved optimally. We then had a whole set of recommendations about financial technologies, products, the supply side of household finance, but perhaps most importantly for this talk, highlighted widespread household financial vulnerability. What I want to do then is to give you a sort of update about the last 4 years since then, about some new research that tells us about some of the themes that we covered in that policy report, which was that we wanted to balance out the need for product simplification in household finance against customization that enabled households to very efficiently conduct functions given very varied financial circumstances that they have. So I'll give you an update on some research on how my thinking certainly and has changed about some of those questions since then. We'll obviously talk about the current pandemic and what we've learned and what I suspect we will learn as we work through the pandemic. And we'll try to outline some post-pandemic research priorities and potentially some policy priorities for household finance in India as well. The main theme that I'd like to focus on there is that financing short-term financial needs during an emergency such as the pandemic can have very adverse consequences on household balance sheets, which can in turn impede progress on building longer-term resilience. And so I will sort of end with an appeal to have greater focus on building that longer-term household financial resilience. So just to give you some background about where Indian households stand in the global wealth distribution, I borrow this figure from a survey article that Christine Badarinza, Vimal Balasubramaniam, who was a panelist at this conference, and myself wrote in the Annual Review of Financial Economics in 2019. And so what this plot shows on the y-axis is different percentiles of wealth in a range of advanced economies. So the US, the UK, Europe, European economies, and so on, with the bottom of that wealth distribution in all of those economies being at roughly the 0th percentile and the top being at the 100th percentile. Now, if we are to line up Indian households and sort of look at the Indian wealth distribution in the global context, if households at the median in India lay exactly at the global median, then we'd be on the 45-degree line here. But what you can see actually is that while it is true that the very poorest in the advanced economies look fairly similar to those in India, PPP adjusted appropriately, and the very wealthiest families in India are approaching the top of the advanced economy wealth distribution at about the 90th percentile of the advanced economy wealth distribution. And if you start going even further into the top 1 percentile or the top 1% of the 1 percentile, you're actually going to see convergence there. But the big gap here is that even at the 80th percentile of the Indian wealth distribution, we're well below the 40th percentile of the advanced economy wealth distribution, meaning that there's essentially a missing middle class in India. So what we call middle class in India, which is roughly 20th to 80th percentiles, is really very, very poor in the global context. And so some things that need to be done here from a redistribution point of view, while we focused a lot on the problems of the very, very poorest, what we need to do, I think, increasingly is to focus on the problems of emerging middle classes, which is one reason why formalization and household finance, not just financial inclusion, is going to be very important. So just let me give you a quick refresher on the RBI committee report. I'll then talk about some of these new insights that I referred to. We'll talk about lessons from the pandemic, and then I'll conclude with some remarks on where I think we should go from here. So if we look at the household balance sheet in selected countries, and if we just focused on the asset side of the balance sheet in these countries, and this is drawn from the RBI Household Finance Committee report, these plots essentially plot the intensive margin, which is to say what is in household balance sheets when you peer into them using detailed household surveys from each one of these countries. And as you can see, you have emerging economies or sort of middle income economies such as China, as well as Thailand, as well as advanced economies here. So one pattern that emerges very clearly is that in India, on the asset side of the balance sheet, illiquid assets such as real estate are extremely dominant. You find some allocation to durable goods such as vehicles and so on. There's a substantial allocation to gold, which is very different from any of the other economies that you see here. And there's a near absence of retirement accounts, as you can see here. This is a feature that is shared with other sort of emerging economies, I would say, such as China and Thailand. But not in these more advanced economies where real estate and other real assets occupy a lower fraction of the balance sheet. And there's a much higher proportion of financial assets as well as retirement savings. Turning to the liability side of the household balance sheet in India as compared to other countries, what you can see immediately is that there's a very large fraction of Indian households' liabilities that are in the form of unsecured debt. And there's much, much less prevalence of the sorts of things that exist in more advanced economies, which are collateralized debt obligations like mortgage debt or other secured debt, which you can see in gray. It's really primarily unsecured debt in India. Of course, you can see that there's some gold loans that offset the asset side of the balance sheet of gold loans. And I know that there's been plenty of research at this conference, potentially also spurred a little bit by the sort of work that we've done in the past. And it's really encouraging to see that there's more work on drilling into the components of these balance sheets and understanding their determinants. But all of this is towards a point, which is we're leading towards something. So bear with me for a little while. Now, if we ask a different question, which we did in the household finance report that we provided in 2017, about the sources of risk that are faced by Indian households. And this is in the pre-pandemic era. And you were to ask them, and this is from the Financial Inclusion Insights Survey, which of these events made the biggest impact on your household income in the last 2 years? And you could see that bad weather or pests destroy crops and livestock is something that, close to 30% of households are worried about and have impacted their household finances very adversely. But the second one is a major medical emergency. The third one is damage to property or business due to a natural disaster. And you can see that over 20% of households are worried about these two as being the primary cause of adverse consequences on household income in the past 2 years. And the pandemic that we're in right now is essentially a combination of these two. It's a major medical emergency and damage to property or business due to a natural disaster, because businesses have essentially had to shut down over the course of this period. And of course, there's also job loss or reduced income of the main income earner because of this. So essentially, the pandemic is kind of a materialization of these very, very adverse consequences on household income. Now, what happens when households face these kinds of emergencies? We documented this in 2017, but this becomes extremely relevant when we consider the current situation. So when you look at what they were asked, which was, what was the main thing done to make ends meet when negative events happen to you or your household? And again, from the Financial Inclusion Insight Survey, you can see that informal sources of financing are the main mechanism of coping with risks. And this actually turns out to perpetuate financial fragility, as I will try and argue in a bit. So you can see that, for example, for medical bills, 43% of the financing is coming from help from friends or family. This is on the extensive margin, the fraction of households. 17% internally financed from household savings. 26% from a loan from a money lender, and you can imagine the interest rates. I'm going to show you a plot on that going forward. And only, when we look at sort of formal loans from a bank, or, even if we were to charitably believe that other is from formal financial sources, which is very unlikely, or even aid from a government or NGO, you see that those are very, very tiny amounts in comparison to the vast amounts that are coming from informal sources. Now, at what interest rates are they paying on these loans that are taken from informal sources? And again, this was all in the Household Finance Report in 2017. You can see that if you look at the percentiles across households of unsecured debt interest rates taken from institutional sources, even at the 80th or 90th percentile, you're seeing rates of interest that are roughly 22% at the very highest end, but they're kind of capped at that point. But then if you look at the non-institutional source unsecured debt interest rates, the reported interest rates are going up to almost 60%. Now, it looks like the interest rate on unsecured debt at the lowest end is actually costless, but of course it isn't costless because loans from family and friends are rarely costless. The interest rate is just paid in social obligations that you incur rather than directly as an arm's length financial contract where you pay someone. But you can see that what this does is essentially there's a shock. The vulnerability to the shock is essentially coming from exposure to things like medical emergencies of the type of the pandemic. How do they cope with that shock? They cope with it by taking informal debt. What happens when you take informal debt? You pay pretty ridiculous interest rates on that informal debt to satisfy that need. That then traps you in a cycle of essentially being indebted for long periods of time because the interest burden is going to add up over a period of time. And so this is in some ways the situation that faces households across the country today who have had to take on these kinds of obligations to essentially cope with the pandemic, which has been the greatest emergency in living memory. Now, of course, you might ask the question, what about insurance? Don't they have insurance? Doesn't that help? But if you look across the states of the country in the All India Debt and Investment Survey, again, this was documented in our Household Finance Report in 2017, the states that most participate in life insurance and pensions are the ones that participate the least in non-institutional debt, and the ones that participate the least in life insurance or pensions are the ones that participate the most in non-institutional debt. And so, as you might expect, this is also sort of correlated with development. So the very poorest states of the country, so you can see kind of, Bihar, Madhya Pradesh, UP, and so on and so forth, essentially over here. And so what's going on? What's going on is that these are the regional areas of the country where you will expect the maximum intensity of the problems that we've just documented. Now, here's another thing that kind of looks a little bit ahead, and we'll sort of move towards my recommendations later, which is essentially when coping with the present, which is occupying a lot of time, psychological space, and financial space for households at the moment, we're ignoring a big looming problem, which is retirement. And ignoring the future is likely to turn out poorly. And so we're anticipating these future resilience gaps as family structure changes, because if you look at the question, what are likely to be the primary means for you to ensure financial security in your old age? And this is from a different survey, the ICE 360 Degrees National Household Survey, which also used to be the NCAER survey. Essentially, you can see that over 50% of households believe that their children are going to be the primary means of financial security. Now, of course, this is pretty standard in traditional societies like our own in India. But of course, as we know, as family structures change, that reliance is going to become harder. And you can see that things like provident funds, government pensions, financial assets and wealth and so on are actually very small in terms of the number of households that they cover. And I'm going to sort of come back to this theme as we move forward. Okay. So what did we say in the Household Finance Committee report that might help resolve some of these issues? This is also looking ahead to the situation that we find ourselves in today. We wanted to facilitate the use and growth of household finance markets, but we wanted to walk a fine line between simplification and customization. So simplification, of course, is extremely helpful. And we were hoping to do that in the form of providing financial advice that is in the best interest of households, simplifying and explaining financial contracts in a manner that is both intuitive and salient for households, engaging in process simplification for entry and use. And this is things like electronically enabled Know Your Customer requirements, eKYC, eliminating wet signatures and other mechanisms, and the use of technology to scale up and depersonalize potentially uncomfortable face-to-face interactions. And essentially, the idea was to make the household balance sheet that we see in India a little bit more future-proof. And so, we said these things in 2017, and while some measures have been taken, we are by no means as far as we need to be. And unfortunately, I think as a result of the pandemic, we will be facing some pretty adverse consequences as a result of this. Now, of course, this need for simplification needs to be balanced against the customization that you might need to deal with the real complexity of household finances. So what you want customized financial products that account for the complexity of financial circumstances along the life cycle, because obviously simplification kind of leads to this one-size-fit-all kind of model. And as we know in household finance, one size doesn't fit all because household financial decisions can be quite complicated. Now, in the report, we talked about the need to balance these two considerations against each other. And so what I want to do in the next few slides is to give you an update on some research that I have done with various teams over the past 4 years since the production of this report that actually suggests that the balance should be pushed even further towards simplification and away from customization. I know that a lot of research that has been done in the research streams is about thinking about sort of financial innovation and more financial products that have extremely innovative ways of doing things. But I think there's a problem here, which is that, in the absence of very firm regulation or extraordinary regulatory capacity, that complexity can actually exacerbate household finance problems and exacerbate inequality. So that's one of the messages that I'm sort of thinking about as time goes on. But let's take a look and see what this research is like. So here are some new insights that I have on simplification versus customization using work that has been done both in Denmark and in India. So here's the problem, which is the trade-off is that despite unprecedented growth in access, there's still limited actual use of financial instruments and contracts in emerging economies. And so, of course, we know that simplification can help to overcome barriers to access these formal financial products. And what's the flip side of this? You could potentially fail to meet actual needs. You could come to grips with the real complexities of household economics. But these are the new research studies that I want to talk to you about, which is that when markets are populated by behavioral agents that don't optimize in the same way that you might think a rational, calculating individual might, but have behavioral sort of features like preferences and beliefs that are increasingly becoming standard in the economics literature, but one might think of them as non-standard relative to the rational caricature of Homo economicus. What you can start to see here is that in these markets, there's a high cognitive, behavioral, and administrative burden on households in both asset and liability markets when you offer them complex options, however well-meaning those complex options might be. And so I want to talk to you about studies from both Denmark, which I have here. This paper is in the American Economic Review in 2020. And then this is a new working paper produced with Vimal Balasubramanian, John Campbell, and Ben Ranish. The other thing that can happen in such markets when you have this high cognitive, behavioral, and administrative burden is that sophisticated households can benefit at the expense of unsophisticated households, in the sense that unsophisticated households can essentially cross-subsidize sophisticated households in such financial markets. And so I will explain some new research that I'm doing using data from the United Kingdom, from the Bank of England, with Jack Fisher, Alessandro Ravazza, my PhD student Lu Liu, and Jagdish Tripathi. And finally, what we show is that a lot of these mechanisms can actually exacerbate the inequality of financial wealth in markets which are populated by behavioral agents and have complex choices that these agents need to face. And so this is a paper in American Economic Review Insights with Ben Ranish and John Campbell. So let me first tell you about this example of refinancing in action in Danish households. So this paper is in the American Economic Review, and just to give you a quick summary of what this work is about, mortgage refinancing turns out to be a very complicated problem for households to solve, because whenever you refinance, you incur a fixed cost and you have an uncertain benefit, because obviously the interest rate at which you refinance then precludes your opportunity to refinance if the interest rate should move in the future, precisely because of the fact that there's a fixed cost associated with doing it. That is to say, just because the interest rate on a new loan is lower than the rate that you have on your existing loan, as long as that there is some non-trivial cost that you have to pay in order to switch mortgages from one to the other, then doing it immediately when the interest rate is slightly lower is not optimal. And in fact, when you do the calculation correctly, this is actually the optimal exercise of an American option, which is a very complicated problem to solve. Now, in Denmark, it's a system that is set up extraordinarily well. Indeed, the Danish system advertises itself as perhaps the best mortgage market in the world. So the Danish system freely permits mortgage refinancing without constraints. It doesn't place any constraints on households. The US system does. And it streamlines options available to households. And yet, in this market, we detect that there's evidence of all kinds of inactivity on the part of households. And in particular, it seems highly regressive because households demonstrate two different kinds of inaction. This time-dependent inaction, which is essentially can be characterized as obliviousness to the available opportunities to refinance. And this is primarily observed in older households with lower education, income, housing wealth, and financial wealth. Whereas there is far less evidence of obliviousness in younger households who are well-educated, high income, have high housing wealth and high financial wealth. So you can immediately start to see how this might be quite regressive. There's also evidence of a different type of inaction that we document in that paper, which is sometimes households have very high opportunity costs of their time, which means that the refinancing decision has got to be sufficiently worthwhile for them to cease doing whatever else they're doing and switch their attention to actually refinancing their mortgages. And that's a slightly more innocuous form of inaction, but we find that that is mainly evident in middle-aged households with relatively higher financial wealth. The bottom line from this paper is that financial capabilities deteriorate late in life, and poorer households make worse financial decisions, even in an environment that is well-designed and freely permits households to exercise choice. So this is a sort of a good example of the fact that choice and customization and the ability to frictionlessly do things doesn't necessarily imply that people make better choices in these markets, because of course there's going to be some distribution of ability of making these choices across the population. The second example is portfolio construction by Indian households. We use very detailed data from the depositories in India, which sort of allows us to study how Indian investors create stock portfolios in a natural environment without assistance from mutual fund managers. So we studied these data in 2011 when the mutual fund share in India was actually fairly low. And so this is a joint paper, which is a working paper with Vimal Balasubramanian, John Campbell, and Ben Ranish. And in that paper, we show that older and larger accounts tend to hold stocks with characteristics that traditionally academics would favor. They generate risk compensation. But younger accounts and smaller accounts tend to be lured in by mega IPOs and stock characteristics that have features that are similar to lotteries. And so what is this telling us? This is telling us that, once again, because you have these, very easy ability to trade and so on and so forth, it's not necessarily beneficial, because you can see that, again, there's something of a redistribution between younger and smaller accounts to older and larger accounts. And in fact, that intuition is confirmed in our paper in American Economic Review Insights that uses the same data, where we show that larger Indian stock accounts earn very similar arithmetic average returns to smaller accounts. So if I just took a simple average of the returns they earned, all would look well. But actually, if you look over the long run, there is substantially higher geometric average returns to larger accounts because they are far more efficiently diversified. They seem to have adopted the finance adage that diversification is very good, don't put all your eggs in one basket. And over a long time period, the more efficient diversification compounds substantially, and that contributes heavily to the inequality of wealth held in risky assets by Indian investors. So what this is saying is that a system that promotes complexity and choice can result in these regressive issues. Now, sort of pushing that theme further and asking, how regressive are these cross subsidies? We do some work in the UK mortgage market, where actually what we do is we study mortgage refinancing using administrative data in the United Kingdom on the total outstanding stock of mortgages. And again, this is a working paper that's available on my website, or will be available on my website shortly, in which we look at, initially in the UK, you can get access to a teaser rate, or an initially fixed discounted rate. And if you don't refinance, that automatically rolls over to a higher revert rate on a mortgage. And so what we find is that there are both prompt refinances and sluggish refinances. And so this can cause cross subsidies, because if you promptly refinance, you take advantage of lower rates on average across your lifetime. And if you sluggishly refinance, then what happens is you're paying a higher average rate across your lifetime. And even providers that are competing with each other will then essentially be able to set a lower average rate, because the sluggish refinances are passing through savings to the prompt refinances. And what we quantify is precisely that, which is that there are these cross subsidies, that rates in a hypothetical single rate world would lie above teaser rates and below these revert rates. And indeed, we document that these cross subsidies are unevenly distributed across the regions of the United Kingdom in a regressive manner, with households in relatively better parts or relatively wealthier parts of the United Kingdom essentially paying lower rates on their mortgages under the current system because of the fact that they more swiftly exercise these opportunities to refinance, whereas households that are in poorer regions of the UK are actually paying higher rates, which is a regressive cross-subsidy. Okay, let me now quickly tell you about the COVID pandemic and what we have learned from the pandemic, and then we'll talk about where we go from here. I think I've got about 10 minutes, if I'm not mistaken, but please correct me if I'm wrong about that. Okay. So the COVID pandemic has been this global shock to household income. It's exposed significant fragility in the economic well-being of households around the world. And it's raised some very tough economic questions. There's significant uncertainty about the ability of health services to cope with the outbreak. The scale and nature of containment measures has been highly uncertain and varied across countries and over time. Perhaps most importantly, from an economist's perspective, there's a question of how households can cope with lockdown-induced disruption to earned income. And the problem is that even if you wanted to balance out the needs for the medical sort of interventions to occur with the enormous costs that you're imposing on households to earned income, then the best way to deal with that is to do direct transfers to households, but in many cases that can be inhibited by the available fiscal space that's available to the government. And so I want to show you some new work on this that is in the form of a blog post that will be soon up on the Economics Observatory with Christian Badarinza, Vimal Balasubramaniam, a PhD student, Luisa Batsoka, and myself. So what we look at is, once again, we look at the household balance sheet in the presence of this income shock, and we update these household surveys to the latest available wave in all cases. And you can immediately see, again, the same things. There's no real difference here. Across emerging economies, the reliance on physical assets is very high. In advanced economies, There's far lower reliance on physical assets such as real estate. There's more in the form of illiquid financial assets such as retirement accounts, and then there's liquid financial assets that also constitute a higher fraction of the total balance sheet. Okay. Thank you for that clarification. I will use the time, but of course I'm happy to open it up for questions at any point in time if that's of interest. Now you can see in advanced economies also that consumption, because we've married these data to consumption data in this most recent analysis, you can see that in emerging economies, food is a larger share of aggregate expenditure for the household. You can see that utilities and transportation is as well. Okay, rent is a larger fraction of the household balance sheet. Debt repayments tend to be lower, but then other expenses, including net savings, tend to be lower as well. And in advanced economies, you can see the patterns here. So the question we really ask is it the case that these liquid assets that exist on the household balance sheet, are they sufficient to cover the consumption that households need to do? And the answer is no. Okay, so this is a fairly complicated slide, but it's worth thinking about. It's actually very simple in the end. All we do is, for each one of these households, we essentially take their liquid assets and then we divide them by monthly consumption. And we ask the question, how long can you last with zero income by just consuming out of the liquid assets that you have across the distribution of all households in these household surveys? And is it the case that your liquid assets can allow you to finance your consumption for 3 months, 6 months, or 12 months? And the answer is there's just very little evidence that this is possible, and the story is much worse in emerging economies than it is in advanced economies. So for example, you can see here that the fraction of all households in these household surveys, which are very detailed, okay, these are the official household surveys from these countries. In advanced economies, it looks like a small fraction of households, something like 40% or thereabouts, are financially vulnerable. I mean, it's not small, it's actually very large, but it's certainly smaller than those for the emerging economies, where over 50% of households are financially vulnerable for at least 3 months, meaning that 50% of households cannot finance consumption for a period of up to 3 months. And then when we ask them to finance consumption for up to 6 months, you find that there's an even larger fraction of vulnerable households, over 60% in this particular case. And then if you ask them to finance consumption for 1 year, you're really looking at less than 25% of households. Now, this is also true in advanced economies. These sort of lines start approaching each other a little bit more. But if you look at these averages a little bit more carefully, what this is saying is the fraction of households that are financially vulnerable for a 3-month period is 41% of all households in advanced economy surveys and 52% of all households in emerging economy surveys. But in India, this proportion is substantially larger. Close to 70% of households cannot finance consumption for up to 3 months. If you ask them to do it for 6 months, you're looking at 77% of households are vulnerable. And if you're looking up to 12 months, 84% of households are vulnerable. And if you think about lockdown-induced disruptions as a result of the pandemic, we're really approaching the 12-month mark in this case. So it's a near universal case of households being financially vulnerable in the setting that we consider in India. So what can you do in response to this kind of vulnerability? What policies can you put into place in order to deal with that problem of financial vulnerability? Well, if you remember at the very early part of what we were doing here in this particular talk, I showed you that the mechanisms that households use to cope with that financial vulnerability is generally by taking high-cost debt from informal sources such as friends and family. In other words, there's something like 16% of households are essentially financing the remaining 84% of households, imposing very onerous obligations on them for the repayment of that debt over longer periods of time. So there's really this kind of self-insurance that's going on in the set of households in the absence of government transfers. And so the problem with that, of course, is that on the very poorer, on the much poorer households and on the middle class that we saw was very hollow at the beginning of this talk, this is likely to push them even further down the wealth distribution, which is one of the reasons why wealth transfers have been an important aspect of what's going on. To understand the policy impact, to ask what sort of measures can you put in place at the baseline, this is a different way of seeing the same information, which is the months after the initial income shock, something like 25% of households are almost immediately vulnerable after 1 month, which rises in advanced economies to something like 60%. In emerging economies, the story is even more stark. Immediately, you get to 25% of households that cannot finance consumption without income for even 1 month. And then this rises up to about 75% or greater of households in emerging economies. On average, remember that for India, the picture is even starker. It's 84% that it reaches at this point after 12 months. So what can be done about this? One possibility is that you just do debt forgiveness. You say, look, whatever debt you have on your balance sheet, we just do a moratorium and we get rid of this. This actually works well in advanced economies because they actually hold more debt. But in emerging economies, debt relief doesn't do very much at all to the fraction of financially vulnerable households. What about liquidating illiquid financial assets? Well, that has a pretty substantial impact because, again, there is quite high holdings of retirement savings and other illiquid financial assets on advanced economy balance sheets. But in emerging economies, this does very little. So the only solution that governments really have is to provide something like income support. And so in many countries, they've provided 50% income support or greater than 50% income support. And you can see that this reduces financial vulnerability to zero for 6 months in both advanced and emerging economies. But then it pretty rapidly rises back up to about 25% of households being financially vulnerable when that income support is removed. Okay, or indeed when that income support continues at only a 50% level because they still need savings in order to make up the rest. It doesn't do the job for the entire 12-month period and an even larger fraction in emerging economies. Now, what's the problem with providing income support? It's the fact that this imposes an enormous fiscal burden on the government. And I believe this is one of the main reasons why the government in India has basically refrained from doing fiscal support. Now, of course, you might argue that the consequences of not providing fiscal support are just as bad as the consequences of providing fiscal support. But in any case, what you can see is this has been true across the advanced economies and the emerging economies. So this is from some indexes. I think the Blavatnik School at Oxford has produced these indexes of containment and health measures imposed by countries. And you can see that in the number of months after the first confirmed 10 cases, that almost immediately, emerging economies on average instituted much more stringent lockdown measures very quickly. And they sort of almost reached the same level. This was, again, not sustainable for longer periods of time, the emerging economies, but the advanced economies took their time a little bit about imposing measures that were as stringent as the emerging economies. And the reason, really, I believe that this is the case, is when you look at an income support measure index, where you can see that in the advanced economies, there was the possibility to introduce far greater amounts of income support for a far longer period of time, for months after the first 10 confirmed cases, but the fiscal support measures were not able to be put in place in the emerging economies. So what's the result? The result is lots of debt in emerging economies, not as much economic support provided, coping mechanisms resulting in heavy debt burdens incurred by these households. So now the question really is, where do we go from here? So I'm going to try and structure my remarks about where do we go from here into two different streams. One is, where do we go from here on research, given everything that we've seen in this talk? And the other one is, where do we go from here on policy, given the situation we find ourselves in the post-pandemic era? So before that, I just want to reflect a little bit on the themes that have been sort of followed through in this conference, given that this is the closing keynote speech. And so I was very gratified to see the research streams. I've sort of redivided these research streams into three broad areas, which sort of, in some sense, kind of fits a little bit better to my mind in terms of a classification. Which is the first research stream, seems to me that there have been research projects seeking to understand household balance sheets in terms of assets and liabilities of households, mainly focusing on the asset side. So focusing on understanding heterogeneity across demographic groups, the dominance of durable goods on household balance sheets, and as an example, gold as an asset class. And then the second stream is understanding cash flows, consumption and savings of households in India. Thinking about spatial variation. One example was a project on the determinants of urban household finances, responses to exogenous events, what happens when cash transfers occur, how does that affect the household balance sheet, And of course, questions of intra-household bargaining, which is, how does bargaining between spouses or between constituents of a household affect consumption and savings of the household? And then finally, the third theme is the theme that we've talked about a little bit during the course of this talk, which is assessing vulnerability, quantifying risk exposure. So there was a farmer risk index or a distress index that I saw, mitigation strategies, so crop insurance, obviously, identifying at-risk subgroups, such as looking at healthcare services for women, and of course, gold as a hedge against inflation, which is a looming risk that we have. So the question is, what are the priorities in the post-pandemic world? So to begin with, in terms of research priorities, I just wanted to sort of bring to your attention a new survey that Francisco Gomez, Michael Haliasos, and I have written, which is coming out in the Journal of Economic Literature in 2021. It is a large compendious survey of the household finance literature and then suggests directions for future research, about 140 pages long. And so, I hope many of you will engage with that document. And so then the questions that I really think are important to address in the post-pandemic world are household finance and the determinants of inequality is an extremely important topic. And I think made even more important by the pandemic, which is what structural inadequacies has the pandemic exposed in our household finance system? How are frictions differentially impacting households across the wealth distribution, across dimensions such as race, ethnicity, caste, and gender? And then the second thing I will say is about methods and techniques, which is, I think, one of the lessons that we're learning about household finance research is that you want to unlock administrative data, granular data on what households actually do, and combine these data with surveys. And what I also would like to recommend is there's a lot of reduced form work I'm seeing in the set of projects that have been put forward in this conference, but I'd like to see more work on structural approaches to addressing these issues. Because data science tools are excellent for describing patterns in the data, but to understand mechanisms and magnitudes and to evaluate counterfactual scenarios, I believe that we need economic models that provide encompassing explanations of these patterns in the data. And certainly in my own research, what I'm trying to do increasingly is to combine very, sort of comprehensive data analysis with at least even a simple economic model which delivers parameters. And those parameters that I think we should focus on are the determinants of households' beliefs, preferences, and constraints, and also describing how households respond to features of their environment. In terms of policy priorities in the post-pandemic world, obviously, the COVID-19 pandemic has been a litmus test for the ability of Indian households to cope with severe income shocks. And I think it's becoming increasingly clear that the adverse consequences of the pandemic will be long-lasting across all segments of the Indian population, and certainly regressive in the sense of being worse as we move down the wealth distribution. I don't think all is well. I think that there are some serious problems that we need to address. But I think that financing these short-term financial needs, as we have seen households do in the RBI Household Finance Report, could severely impede progress on building longer-term household financial resilience in India. And I think we should focus on these long-term issues as a matter of priority, with a research emphasis on building household financial resilience. Because this is not the final crisis that we will face, because even bigger ones, such as the climate crisis, are looming at present. So while we deal with the current crisis, we must not forget about the fact that there will be ones in the future. So what should we look at ahead at? In the short and medium term, I believe we should anticipate the effects of potential increases in inflation. We should think about mortgage product design, obviously in the presence of adjustable rate mortgages that exposes especially constrained households to unexpected rate increases, which can test their resilience and cause household finances to become extremely fragile. We should think about mechanisms to increase the financialization and collateralization of the durable goods, that a very high fraction of physical assets that we saw on Indian households' balance sheets. We should, of course, thinking about technology to automatically trigger emergency disbursements, which is very relevant in the case of insurance payouts and will become increasingly relevant as we move into climate-related disruptions, but also potentially useful as a general incentive for not just financial inclusion, but household finance. I think this is very important. And we should obviously think about default options and facilitating the adoption of new technologies. But I think just thinking about nudging is not in any way, shape, or form the only solution. Finally, I think we should save for and finance retirement. We should think more about micro pension schemes, customization, scalability, and annuitization. And the recommendation we had in the RBI Household Finance Committee report was to think about how households could access a basic household finance kit with assets, insurance, and liabilities. Okay, so I'll stop here. And in case there's a question or two, I'm very happy to answer it. And thank you for giving me the chance to present this book.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ramaturai, for this enlightening session. The Household Finance practice at Dvara really admires your work, and it has been amazing to have you with us. So we actually do have a few questions by the audience. So I'll just start asking them.
Great.
So the first question is on the simple versus customized products issue. The MFI RCTs have shown us heterogeneous impacts of even a simple product like microcredit. Shouldn't the comparison be advised versus non-advised sale rather than simple versus complex?
So this is an interesting question. And I think one of the things that there's a lot of research on, I've not done as much on this, although I have some ideas in this space as well, is that advice can sort of generate its own complexity as well. And so there are plenty of conflicts of interest that we understand in advised versus non-advised. And so one of the reasons that we sort of have shied away from the provision of advice is that unless you have a fiduciary obligation to your advisee to deliver them with precisely the correct advice, then it can be extremely difficult to generate guarantees that you're receiving advice that is in your best interest. Now, suppose you could solve those problems, that would be a reasonable way to go. But remember, it's costly. Advice doesn't come for free, so we'd have to bundle in some costs there. An alternative is to say we create, complex financial products that allow people to sort of select them. But the problem that we've realized again and again is that any complexity combined with the need to rely on someone's knowledge that is greater than your own can generate significant conflicts of interest. And so increasingly what I'm sort of feeling is that what we need to do is to provide a no-frills basic solution for most people. And so let me give you a simple example that might be illuminating in this case. So different countries during the pandemic have struggled with the way to deal with vaccination strategies for the vast majority of the population. One approach has been, let us find a really complex way of identifying risks, scoring people on risks, and then we go after the people that have the highest risks. The problem with that system is it's open to abuse. Everybody runs to sort of show you their condition that sort of pushes them right to the front of the queue. There's a problem here with sort of people coming through the back channels and then sort of producing fake documents that allow you to run to the front of the queue. In contrast, and I think this is one thing that the UK has got right, the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunization decided very early on that there would be only one criteria that determined vaccination order, and that was age. And it went extremely fast as a result of that, because there were no exemptions, there was no breaking the rules. If you were above a certain age, you were called. If you were below a certain age, you were not called. And at this point, we're moving to above 25-year-old people, and we have near universal coverage across the spectrum. And so what is this telling you? It's telling you that as soon as you have a complex system, it's potentially a problematic system. Now, this is not the final word on the story, but I think there are certain features here that I think are worth thinking about more carefully.
Right, thank you. And since in this particular answer, you also mentioned like bundling could also be, be helpful in this context. So there's a question which sort of says that I especially liked your comment about the push towards simplification instead of customization. Now, based on this, what are your thoughts about like bundling of products such as insurance and credit or insurance and savings for low-income households to increase their uptake?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we tend to think of bundling, generally speaking, as being a difficult strategy to justify. And I think regulators are justifiably worried about bundling strategies. Now, that having been said, we have a little bit of a regulatory jumble in our country at the moment, which is to say that there's a separate insurance regulator and a separate regulator of credit products that face households. There's a separate regulator for pensions products and a separate regulator for insurance products and so on and so forth. And so, bundling is in general not good, but when you have, jurisdiction shopping that you can do in an economy which has, many, many regulators, then it may be that sort of bringing various products together under a single regulatory ambit may be worthwhile. I'm not suggesting that the way to do that is by bundling, but I'm saying that that's a trade-off that we need to consider. I would be more in favor of unbundling, but then consolidating the regulatory umbrella into a single regulator that deals with consumer finance issues.
Right, that makes sense. Thank you. So moving on to the third question. In the inaction study on Danish households, you said that poorer households make worse decisions. Would you tie in this finding to some of the work done by Santil Mullainathan and others on the concept of scarcity leading to cognitive overload and therefore worse decisions?
Yeah, I mean, so this is interesting. I think the answer is potentially yes, although I will say sort of two things about that, which is one response to having high opportunity costs for switching tasks, if that is the way that so I mean, I'm very familiar with the scarcity of time explanation, but the scarcity of time explanation can cut in two ways. One way it could go is that you simply don't have the time to do things because your other activities are generating more productive gains for you. And so you just indefinitely postpone until the financial incentive is large enough to deal with the problem. We don't find that that's the form of the issue that we detect in Danish mortgage refinancing. Okay, so it is not the case that what's happening is that poorer households are somehow solving an optimization problem that says it's not worth my while to refinance my mortgage right now. What's actually happening is more of an information scarcity story, where it seems like what's happening for poorer Danish households is they just seem oblivious to the opportunity in the first place. So now you might then sort of consolidate the two explanations and say, well, maybe the reason that they're oblivious is because they just don't have the time to find out about mortgage refinancing. Well, the financial incentive for finding out about mortgage refinancing is pretty big. So it's not a constraint explanation. There may be an information transfer explanation as well. And perhaps what we need to do is to find a way to provide the information to low-income households in a way that they will easily understand and easily be able to access.
Right. So this brings me to the final question that we have. So this basically, like from some of the research that we have seen in the past 4 days, we saw that low-income households generally desire flexible and liquid assets that also give high returns. So flexibility is basically in terms of repayment schedules or saving schedules, wherein like no penalties are basically like implied on them in case of default. So now though there's like a lot of supply side issues in this entire problem as well, but there are also like certain houses which simply do not desire products such as, like health insurance or other kinds of specific kinds of insurance. So how do you suggest we tackle with a problem such as this? The problem of demand per se and not, just the supply side issues.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting problem, which is that, I think in some of these cases, if you were to sort of look a little bit more closely at the reasons why households don't demand certain things, I think it's very easy to say, well, they just demand what they demand. There's a psychological problem that sort of, and I think, so I will say two things about this. The first is in some cases, these preferences must be taken seriously. So there's a nice new paper by Laurent Calvé and co-authors, which shows that even though structured products have heavy embedded options. So for example, suppose you offer a household and say, I'm going to give you access to stock market returns and I'm going to downside protect you, which is essentially like selling you both a put option as well as access to the equity index at the same time. Now, this is the kind of product that financial economists traditionally abhor because they think this is horrible. You're selling them expensive options and you shouldn't be doing this. But what they show is that for many households that have loss-averse preferences, this is actually an excellent way to get them to participate in financial markets. Because what you're doing is, while there are costs associated with these options, the net benefit of these options is that it induces households to participate who would otherwise be reluctant to participate. Now, I think there's something to be said for that. And I think more work needs to be done on this. But again, I would say we need to be very, very careful about this because, there's a question about why such households want these kinds of products or what's going on with this. I mean, if it's a preference related issue, then I can understand, which is you allow them to get over the hump of their preferences. But if it's purely an information friction, I'm not sure that it makes a lot of sense because all you're doing then is you're reinforcing the idea that stocks can only go up and never go down, which is really a terrible lesson for households to learn. So I think one has to sort of think very carefully about the design of these products and ask, why is it that these households particularly like these kinds of complicated features? And if it's for a preference-related reason, it sounds good to me. If it's for an information-related reason, I'm not so sure that that's optimal.
Right, thank you so much. There's one final question which has come up, so maybe we can take that one and
Sure.
Close this session. So in India, the mortgages are now linked to policy rates and can be freely refinanced. Has any study in India regarding refinancing been done? The customers have benefited in declining rates scenario. Will they not be exposed to huge risks if inflation shoots up and policy rates start moving up?
Excellent. So that particular change was done in response to one of the recommendations in my committee's report in 2017. So I'm delighted to see that they've actually taken action on that. There was also a Janak Raj committee that suggested this for the monetary policy transmission mechanism. But in this particular case, it was my committee's report that suggested this from a household finance perspective, and indeed was the first report to suggest this change. So I'm delighted to see that it has actually taken off. Now, the question really is, why, does that impose risks? Well, we know from lots and lots of finance research, some excellent papers by Joao Coco and John Campbell, and we're working on some work on mortgage choice as well, that yes, if you're a financially constrained household, you may wish to take an adjustable rate mortgage with a fluctuating interest rate to alleviate your current financial constraint if you believe your personal income is going to rise in the future and you're going to be able to pay it off. So it allows you to take a larger mortgage because you'll lower interest payments in non-inflation related periods. Now, of course, what does that expose you to? It exposes you to the idea that there's going to be enormous income fluctuations, especially if interest rates rise a lot. Yes, that's definitely a risk for many households. And I really do hope that the Reserve Bank of India is monitoring this very carefully, because yes, of course, it's an issue in that particular case. And indeed, the choice of a fixed rate mortgage instrument versus an adjustable rate mortgage instrument is one that needs to be considered very carefully. However, the thing that I will say is that the system that we have now, where rates are linked to external benchmarks, is extremely different from the issue of whether households should be given a choice between fixed rate mortgages and adjustable rate mortgages. They are given a choice even under the old system, which didn't link these rates externally. And what used to happen was each and every bank would quote relative to its own marginal cost of lending rate, the MCLR, which meant that every bank would quote relative to something completely different, and there was no comparability across mortgages, nor was there any linking of policy rates to mortgages in any way that was symmetric. In fact, under the old system, when there was an inflation shock, if anything, household budgets would be even more compromised than they are under the current situation. So the current situation has solved lots of problems, but of course, there is still the underlying economic problem of choice that households need to deal with the choice of an adjustable rate mortgage versus a fixed rate mortgage system. That's not a problem that's been caused by this policy change. It's one that's been exposed and alleviated by this policy change. So that's all I have to say, but I'm glad to see that that change has happened.
Thank you so much. This has been absolutely delightful. I would now request Dr. Indradeep Ghosh, Executive Director of Dvara Research, to give his remarks and vote of thanks, and with that, bring the session to a close. Thank you everyone for being a lovely audience. Please welcome Dr. Indradeep Ghosh.
Thank you, Niyati. And thanks, Professor Ramadurai. That was a really interesting session, and I look forward to reading some of this recent research that you have pointed us to. So, this is the closing comments for the conference, and there are going to be no questions, so I can be a little provocative. In the sessions that we have had for the conference, many different strands of inquiry have emerged. I will not attempt to summarize them. In fact, I thought that Professor Ramadurai did a very good job of summarizing them into three categories. What I will do is I will offer some methodological reflections, which are of a somewhat abstract nature and also somewhat contrarian. So I request your indulgence for the next 10 minutes or so. So the first methodological point I will make is that we need to understand that the household is a social unit as much as it is an economic unit. The household is not a person, but a nexus of social relations, and the household itself is embedded in a nexus of social relations at the level of the community. Now, finance is also a social relation, and we can think of formal finance as sometimes lubricating these existing social relations and sometimes disrupting them. Now, you might think that some of those existing relations probably should not be lubricated by formal finance. And equally, you might think that some of those existing social relations should not be disrupted. But before we can sit in judgment of these relations, I think we should try to understand their true nature. We should try to understand the mechanisms by which these relations operate. And in doing so, we need to exercise some caution. Just because I see a hierarchy inside a household, it doesn't have to follow that there is some exploitation going on. Not all hierarchies are exploitative. Similarly, if we find a norm that is regulating the relationship of a wife to her husband or of a husband to his wife, we should not immediately presume or try to force fit that norm into the language of power dynamics and bargaining dispositions. Much more is going on typically at the level of the household, and we need to try to understand all of it, and we should bring a self-awareness about the vocabulary that we are using and the categories that we are employing. My second methodological point is that we should abandon the binary of rational versus behavioral and emotional. Household decision making is happening against the background of emotional relations, and we should try to characterize these emotional connections as faithfully as we can. One thing I should say is that when we do so, we should not default to the position that emotion is miscognition. Emotion is not miscognition. In fact, the tendency to think of emotion as miscognition produces typically two outcomes, methodological outcomes. One is to take an emotionally charged decision and to say that it is a sign of cognitive bias. And this typically happens when we haven't fully uncovered the context for that decision. The other, which is a logical fallacy, in fact, is to take the emotion or the object of emotion to fold it into the utility function and to say that the decision maker is rational after all. Neither of these two approaches is satisfactory, I think. Thinking in terms of binaries also sometimes leads us to make inferences that may be premature and therefore invalid. For example, the empirical finding that gold is a good hedge for stocks or inflation does not validate the proposition that Indian households make rational decisions with regard to gold. If I'm observing X's X making choices and I'm able to rationalize X's choices, that does not mean that X is actually choosing rationally. I think it gets us one step closer to validating the proposition that the choice is rational, but there's still some inferential distance to be covered. And till such distance has indeed been covered, the empirical finding cannot falsify the proposition that Indian households have an emotional connection to gold. So what I will say is that maybe Indian households are acting rationally and emotionally. And can we find an intelligent, meaningful way to talk about this confluence of reason and emotion instead of categorizing these decisions into one bucket or the other? Now, what this means is that in the end, this does not mean that we stop theorizing. In fact, it just means that in our theorizing, we begin to exercise more care and we make room for context. And this means that we should feel free to bring in analytical categories from the other social sciences and the humanities. And we should become comfortable with theorizing in ways that do not involve mathematical inference. Sometimes this is spoken of as qualitative research, but I prefer this framing because we are preserving here the importance of inference as an integral aspect of research and doing theory. So more context, but context is not reducible to constraints. Things like social norms, religious norms, cultural norms are context, but they are not constraints. They do not constrain, they regulate. there is a consequential difference here that we should respect and be mindful of when we are doing this kind of interdisciplinary work. We should not attempt to force fit everything that we wish to think about into the language of economics. Now, what shall we gain from the kind of approach that I have laid out here? One gain is, of course, a better understanding of household finance research, which is good enough reason, I think. But there are other kinds of gains that we can make if we take a more pluralistic approach in our thinking. The case of professional ethics is an example I will offer today as both the kind of gain that we can make by using pluralistic thinking, and also as an example of the kind of thinking I'm talking about. Now you might, how should we think about professional ethics for financial service providers? You might think that this is an intellectual exercise at best, but I think you would be wrong. How we conceptualize professional ethics in finance is absolutely crucial in how, say, we organizations like Dvara Research, how we communicate our research to policymakers, regulators, and even practitioners. So usually the approach is to invoke the principal agent framework, information asymmetries, and the like to make the case for customer protection. But note that word protection, that suggests that the customer's relation to the financial service provider can be characterized as one of transference. What is transference? Transference is actually an idea from psychotherapy. It refers to the situation where the therapeutic subject transfers the relation that that subject had with their parents to the figure and the person of the therapist. So literally, the transference relation is rooted in the household, and it is no doubt an emotional one. Now, the inspiration here is Talcott Parsons, probably the most important sociologist of the 20th century after Emile Durkheim and Max Weber. In his 1951 book, The Social System, Parsons turns his attention to the doctor-patient relationship as the paradigmatic professional relationship. If you read that chapter, you will find that much of what economists later in the 1960s and 70s begin to characterize under the rubric of principal agent and information asymmetry is already there in that Parsons chapter, except it is framed in a different way. Parsons points out that the emotional nature of the doctor-patient relationship requires a code of professional ethics to regulate that relationship. Now, Kenneth Arrow, writing his landmark health economics paper in 1963, actually mentions Parsons explicitly in the paper. Most people who read that paper do not seem to notice this, that Arrow mentions Talcott Parsons, and says that like Parsons, he will also take this idea of professional ethics, but he will transplant it into the economics terrain of risk and markets and information asymmetries. At the same time, Arrow says that it will be impossible to construct an economic or business case for professional ethics. And in a superb, absolutely stunning rhetorical turn of phrase, Arrow says in his paper, the very word profit signals a denial of the trust relations. So it would seem that Arrow is unable to ground the code of professional ethics in the economics terrain. What he ends up doing actually is that he ends up subsuming professional ethics into the doctor's utility function, because he says that the doctor should have a taste for improving the health of others. Now, this, I'm afraid, is tautological. In fact, I think Parsons has the correct approach, because he thinks of professional ethics as a higher order social force that transcends the individual and that exerts its normative power from outside or from above the individual. Now, if you look at the discourse of health economics, it employs the language of incentive compatibility constraints and mechanism design at the atomistic individual level. And this is not entirely unwarranted, but it is not complete. It is completed only when we also bring in this kind of sociological conceptualization of an ethical code that will regulate individual behavior, since all contracts are incomplete and ethics cannot therefore be written into a contract, because ethics is about contingency. So we see that there are real gains to be made from this kind of pluralistic thinking. And I would really hope that we can, as researchers, educate ourselves in multiple vocabularies so that we can better characterize what we are seeing in the world as faithfully as possible. So that concludes my comments, and I will finally give a vote of thanks. I mean, this has been a wonderful conference for me to attend and sit through. And I just would like to take a couple of minutes to thank everybody whose contributions made this conference possible. So first, our funders, our primary funders have been Omidyar Network and Dvara Trust. And then our associate funding partners have been TransUnion, CIBIL, and Dvara KGFS. The Robert Bosch Center for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at IIT Madras have served as a knowledge partner. Thank you to IIT Madras. Kriya Graduate School of Business has agreed to publish a select set of papers from this conference in their Journal of Emerging Markets Finance. So thanks goes out to Kriya GSB. I'd like to thank all of the speakers and the research teams. For the research teams, I don't only have thanks, but also admiration and respect for the kind of effort that they have put in over the course of the last year during very, very trying times. And we have seen a very diverse set of research papers. So really, congratulations to the research teams as well as thanks. In December, we had a set of roundtables where we invited some discussants to give feedback to the research teams midway through their research projects. So I'd like to thank all of those discussants. And also, two people served as advisors throughout the course of the research projects, Professor Nandan Sundar Sanam and our very own Nishant. So thank you. I'd like to thank our mentors, Bindu and Samir, who have supported and facilitated the creation of a household finance research practice at Dvara and made this conference possible. I'd like to thank the household finance research team and the Dvara Trust communications team for all their work, hard work, putting this conference together. All of you deserve well-earned rest. And finally, I'd like to thank you, the audience, for making this conference a success. And with that, I'd like to bring the conference to a close. Please be well, stay safe, do good work, and please keep in touch. Thank you.